She had 42 years of being careful, 42 years of choosing her words, smoothing her edges, making herself smaller so Grant Holloway could feel larger. And in 60 seconds, standing in the marble foyer of a house she had sacrificed everything to build with him, watching a pregnant woman press her hand possessively against her husband's chest, Evelyn Ashcroft understood with cold, surgical clarity that she had never been a wife. She had been a liability he hadn't finished eliminating yet. If you've ever loved someone who is quietly planning your destruction, stay until the very end. Like this video, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it ended had started the way every morning in the Holloway estate started, with performance. Evelyn woke at 6:15 without an alarm because her body had long ago stopped trusting silence. She lay still for several seconds in the California king bed, listening to the particular quality of the quiet, the kind that told her Grant had either not come home or had come home too late to bother removing his shoes before collapsing somewhere else in the house. She had learned to read silence the way sailors read water, the texture of it, the weight. This particular silence said she was alone, and that fact had stopped hurting her approximately 2 years ago, which told her something about the state of her marriage she had chosen not to examine too closely. She sat up. Her back ached. It always ached now, a residual gift from the spinal surgery 18 months ago that Grant had attended for exactly 40 minutes before excusing himself for a conference call that, she later discovered, had not existed. She had been in recovery for 6 hours. He had sent flowers, peonies, her least favorite. She had thanked him anyway because that was the agreement, the unspoken contract of being Evelyn Ashcroft. You absorbed the small humiliations quietly, and you kept moving. She showered. She dressed in charcoal wool trousers and a cream blouse that she knew made her look composed even when she wasn't. She had built a wardrobe that functioned as armor, and she wore it accordingly. By 7:30, she was downstairs in the kitchen with a cup of coffee she didn't particularly want, standing at the window that overlooked the rear garden, watching morning light hit the hedgerows in long, flat angles. Nathan Cole appeared at 7:45 the way he always did, moving through the east corridor with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years making himself necessary without making himself conspicuous. He was 61, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that seemed out of place in a house this expensive. And he had worked for Evelyn, not for Grant, a distinction he had maintained with careful precision for nearly a decade, since before the renovation of the East Wing. He set a leather folder on the counter near her elbow without speaking. She didn't look at it immediately. "He'd get in last night?" she asked. "Around 3, Nathan said. "He left again at 6. "The Chicago flight?" "Private terminal, yes ma'am." She nodded slowly, turning the coffee cup in her hands. Nathan didn't offer anything else. He rarely did. He had learned that she asked the questions she wanted answered and left room for the ones she was still deciding about. It was one of the reasons she trusted him. He didn't fill silence with noise, and in this house, noise had always been a weapon. She picked up the folder. Inside were 2 documents she recognized immediately: a trust amendment she had authorized 3 weeks ago and a property valuation update for the estate's secondary residence in Connecticut. She reviewed both briefly, noting the annotations Nathan had added in his careful, blocky handwriting along the margins. "The Connecticut filing go through?" she asked. "Confirmed yesterday afternoon. Recorder's office in Fairfield County, fully processed." "And the account transfer?" "Completed Thursday. The routing structure holds. It looks like standard estate management from the outside." "Which it is," he added, because accuracy mattered to him. "Technically." She closed the folder. "Thank you, Nathan." He took the folder back and left the way he had come, his footsteps barely audible on the stone floor. Evelyn stood at the window a little longer. The coffee went cold. She set it in the sink and went about her morning. She did not know, standing there in that kitchen that she had spent 4 years making beautiful, that in approximately 9 hours her entire understanding of the word ordinary would be destroyed. Grant came home at 4:53 in the afternoon. She heard the car before she heard the door, the particular sound of the Bentley's engine cutting in the circular drive, followed by voices. 2 voices. She was in the study on the second floor, reviewing documents with the kind of focused attention she only allowed herself when the house was empty, and the sound of a second voice stopped her cold. Grant didn't bring colleagues home without warning. He had rules about the house, about privacy, about the careful separation of his professional life from the domestic theater they performed together. Rules that she now understood had always been designed to protect him rather than to protect their marriage. She moved to the window and looked down. Grant stood beside the Bentley in a charcoal suit that she recognized as the one he'd worn to Geneva 3 weeks ago. He was 49 years old, silver-haired, broad in the shoulders, in a way that still photographed well at charity events. And he was smiling. Not the controlled, calculated smile he used in boardrooms, but something looser and more private than she had seen on his face in years. Standing beside him, one hand resting on the roof of the car, was a woman. She was younger. Evelyn registered this the way you register a change in temperature, factually, without emotion, filing it immediately into an existing category. She had suspected other women for 2 years, had found small disconnected evidence she'd chosen not to confront because confrontation would have required her to act before she was ready, and she had never been willing to act before she was ready. But she hadn't expected this. Not the woman being here, not the quality of the smile on Grant's face, not the way the woman's free hand rested, automatically and without self-consciousness, against the curve of her own abdomen. Evelyn stepped back from the window. She stood in the center of the study and breathed. In through the nose, out slow, the way the physical therapist had taught her after the surgery, when the nerve pain had been bad enough to make her vision blur. She applied the same technique now to a different kind of pain. Not physical, not quite, but something that moved through her chest with the same invasive precision. She gave herself 45 seconds. Then she straightened her shoulders, walked out of the study, and went downstairs to meet her husband's guest. She reached the foyer at the same moment they came through the front door. Grant saw her first. Something flickered across his face. Not guilt, not exactly, more like recalibration, the expression of a man rapidly adjusting his strategy. He had always been better at managing information than managing emotion, and that facility with information was what had made him wealthy and what had ultimately made him dangerous. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was even. "I should have called ahead." "You should have," she agreed. Her voice was equally even. She looked at the woman. The woman was perhaps 32, 33, dark-haired, with the kind of bone structure that made her beautiful, in a way that required no maintenance. She was visibly pregnant. 6 months, perhaps 7, which meant Grant had been sleeping with her before, during, and after Evelyn's surgery. The woman's expression held something complicated, not guilt exactly, more like a person who had been told a story and was now beginning to notice the parts that didn't fit. "This is Celeste Rowan," Grant said. "She'll be staying here." The sentence landed in the foyer like something dropped from a considerable height. Evelyn looked at Grant. "Say that again." "Celeste will be staying in the house." His tone had shifted slightly. Flatter, more deliberate. He was watching her the way he watched opponents across negotiating tables, measuring her reaction, calculating how much force he'd need to apply. "The East Wing guest suite, temporarily." "She's carrying your child." "Yes." The word was small and precise and absolutely devastating, and Grant delivered it with the calm of a man who had rehearsed this conversation and was now simply executing it. Evelyn understood in that moment that this was not an impulsive confession. This was a deployment. He had chosen this day, this hour, this particular configuration of information to do maximum damage while leaving her the minimum amount of stable ground to stand on. He had calculated her. He had decided she would collapse. He was wrong. Evelyn looked at Celeste. The younger woman's jaw was tight, and there was something in her eyes, not cruelty, not triumph, but a faint unease that Evelyn filed away without showing she'd noticed. Then she looked back at her husband, and for a long moment she simply studied his face. The face she had woken up beside for 14 years. The face she had held her breath watching during the 3 days he'd spent supposedly at her side after her surgery. The face of a man she had believed she understood, and now recognized as a stranger wearing a very convincing mask. She reached up and removed her wedding ring. It was a 7-carat oval diamond in a platinum setting that Grant had given her on their 5th anniversary to replace the original ring he said hadn't been worthy of her. She set it on the marble console table beside the foyer's flower arrangement with the care of someone placing down something that no longer belonged to them. She smoothed the front of her blouse. She looked at Grant one final time. "I'll have Nathan prepare the east wing," she said. Then she walked away. She heard Grant say something behind her. Her name, clipped and uncertain, the voice of a man whose plan had just produced an unexpected result. But she didn't stop. She moved through the corridor toward the rear of the house, through the kitchen, out the back door, and into the garden. The hedgerows caught the last of the afternoon light. She sat down on the stone bench near the far wall, the one she'd had installed after the surgery when she'd needed somewhere outside and quiet, and she pressed both hands flat against her thighs and she breathed. In, out, in, out. She did not cry. She had spent the better part of 3 years ensuring she would not need to cry. Nathan found her there 20 minutes later. He came across the garden without hurry, carrying a light jacket because the October air had turned sharp, and draped it across her shoulders without comment. Then he sat beside her on the bench. "You heard?" she asked. "Enough," she nodded. "East Wing Suite. For the woman." "I'll see to it." Neither of them spoke for a moment. A bird moved somewhere in the hedgerows, and then it was quiet again. "Nathan," she said finally, "how long before the account structures are fully activated?" He was quiet for a moment, and she knew he was reviewing timelines internally, running calculations the way she'd taught him over 3 years of careful preparation. Primary structures are already complete. The secondary accounts, the ones routed through the Delaware instruments, those need 48 hours to be fully independent. The property documentation in Connecticut is already filed. The trust holding the East Wing renovation contracts is clean. "And the main property title?" Nathan turned his head slowly and looked at her. "Filed with the county clerk 14 months ago, Mrs. Ashcroft. The estate is held in the Ashcroft Family Preservation Trust. Grant's name appears as a beneficiary, not an owner." He paused. "He hasn't checked in over 2 years." She exhaled very slowly. "He doesn't think there's anything to check." "No, he doesn't." She looked out at the garden. The light was fading now, the hedgerows going dark at their edges, and somewhere inside the house, Grant Holloway was making plans he believed were already complete. He believed he had won. He believed that bringing Celeste here, making that announcement in the foyer with that practiced calm, had been the final move in a game Evelyn hadn't known she was playing. He believed she had absorbed the blow the way she had always absorbed his blows, quietly, obediently, with the docile grace he had come to count on. He had mistaken her silence for defeat. He had never understood that she had been building something in that silence, that every morning she had spent swallowing indignity, and every night she had spent lying in that enormous bed while he was absent had been transformed painstakingly and deliberately into preparation. He had handed her 14 years to learn every pressure point in his financial architecture, every vulnerability in his legal structure, and she had used every single day of them. "Start the process," she said. Nathan nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." He stood, and she stood, and they walked back toward the house in the gathering dark. The lights in the east wing were already on. She could see them through the windows. Someone had begun airing out the guest suite, turning down the linen, preparing the room for the woman Grant had brought to replace her in her own home. She watched those lights without any particular feeling and then looked away. Inside, she went upstairs. Not to the master suite. She had already, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, decided she would never sleep in that room again. She went instead to the small sitting room at the end of the north corridor, the room she had unofficially claimed 2 years ago when the distance between her and Grant had made sharing a bedroom feel like an exercise in performance she was no longer willing to sustain. She closed the door. She sat in the chair by the window with her knees together and her hands in her lap, and she stared at the middle distance for a long time. Then she reached under the cushion of the chair and removed a slim leather portfolio she had placed there 6 months ago, the one she had told herself she was keeping just in case, the one she had told herself she hoped she would never need to open. She opened it. The documents inside were organized in the precise order she and Nathan had assembled them over 31 months of quiet, careful work. Property filings, trust instruments, account routing records, A chronological record of wire transfers she had photographed covertly over the course of a year, each one documented with date, amount, and originating account. And at the back of the portfolio, in a sealed envelope she had not yet opened herself, a file Nathan had handed her 8 weeks ago with the words, "I think you need to have this, but I think you should wait until you're ready to act before you read it." She looked at that envelope for a long time. She wasn't sure she was ready. She wasn't sure what ready looked like when your husband had just installed his pregnant mistress in your home with the calm of a man changing a business arrangement. She wasn't sure she was the woman who could do what those documents might require her to do. But she thought about Grant's face in the foyer, the way he'd watched her remove the ring, the flicker of recalibration, the rapid repositioning, the absolute absence of anything resembling remorse. She thought about the word temporarily and what kind of man used that word in that sentence with that tone of voice. And she thought about the 45 seconds she had given herself to breathe before going downstairs. And she thought about the fact that she had given herself that time at all. The discipline of it, the control of it, the years it had taken to be a woman who could do that. She thought about the surgery, about waking up in recovery and asking for Grant and being told he'd stepped out, about the flowers that had arrived the following morning. Peonies, her least favorite. She picked up the sealed envelope and broke it open. She began to read. By the time she finished, it was past midnight. The house was quiet. The lights in the east wing were off. Somewhere below her, Grant Holloway slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who believed himself untouchable. Evelyn sat in the chair with the papers in her hands, and she felt something move through her that was not grief and not anger and not fear, but something colder and more precise than any of those things. She recognized it the way you recognize a tool that was made specifically for your hand. She had just read evidence that during her surgery, during the 72 hours she had spent in a hospital bed fighting a complication no one had warned her about, Grant Holloway had made a series of phone calls to a legal firm in Chicago she had never heard of. Those calls, logged and partially documented by Nathan through sources Evelyn had decided not to ask him to explain, pertained to a specific legal instrument, a spousal survival clause in a financial agreement Grant had signed with a partnership group 6 months before the surgery. A clause that had significant financial implications if Evelyn died before him. He had been preparing for her death while she was still fighting to live. And the Chicago firm, the one he'd been quietly calling from a burner phone Nathan had managed to trace, was not just a legal firm. Nathan had included a single annotated page at the back of the envelope. 3 names, 2 corporate entities, a network of financial structures that an FBI task force had been quietly mapping for 2 years. Grant Holloway wasn't just a cheating husband. She didn't yet know the full shape of what he was, but she was going to find out. She had already begun. What she couldn't know, sitting in that chair in the silent north corridor of a house that was now, legally and absolutely, hers, was that someone else had also noticed her reading that envelope. That somewhere in the house, a phone had already been used to send a message to Chicago. That by morning, the first moves of a very different kind of chess game had already been made by players she had not yet identified, in a game she had not yet fully understood she was inside. The clock was already running. She just didn't know it yet. She didn't sleep. Not because she couldn't. She had learned, in the years of Grant's late returns and unexplained absences, to sleep in fragments, to take rest where it was available the way a soldier takes cover. But tonight she chose not to. She sat in the chair in the north corridor until the sky outside the window went from black to the particular deep blue that preceded dawn, and she read every document in Nathan's envelope twice, and then she read the annotated page a 3rd time, and by the time the first bird started somewhere in the garden, she had a map in her head. Not complete, not without gaps, but enough. She showered at 5:30, changed into fresh clothes, dark jeans, a simple gray sweater, flat shoes, nothing that required maintenance. She needed to move today, and she needed to move without drawing attention, and the armor wardrobe was for performance. Today was not a performance. She found Nathan in the kitchen at 6:05. He was already there, which told her he hadn't slept much either. He had a legal pad on the counter, and a pen in his hand and a cup of coffee that had gone cold beside him. And when she walked in, he looked up with the expression of a man who had been waiting for instructions. "You read it," he said. It wasn't a question. All of it. She poured herself coffee, standing at the counter with her back to him for a moment. "The Chicago firm. How long have you known?" A pause. 8 weeks, when I handed you the envelope." "How did you find them?" Another pause, longer this time. "The wire transfer records you photographed. One of the routing numbers was irregular. It passed through a clearinghouse I recognized from a previous employer before I came to work for you." He set the pen down. "I spent 3 weeks verifying before I put it in writing." She turned. "Previous employer meaning what, exactly?" He met her eyes. "Meaning I've seen that kind of routing structure before, Mrs. Ashcroft. In a professional context. That's all I'll say about it." She looked at him for a moment. Nathan Cole had appeared in her life as a referral from a property attorney 11 years ago, arriving with impeccable credentials and an air of calm competence that had made her trust him immediately. She had never pushed on his history. He had never volunteered it. There had always been between them a mutual agreement to focus on the present without interrogating the past. She was beginning to understand that agreement had protected them both. "All right," she said, "then tell me what we need to do today." He picked up the legal pad. "The secondary accounts, I can have those fully independent by end of business. The trust instruments are already clean, but there's one weak point." He tapped the pad. "The operating account for the household. Grant's name is still on it as primary holder. If he moves to freeze it before we complete the restructuring, how long to remove him? Technically, the trust amendment gives you unilateral authority, but the bank will want documentation reviewed in person. You'd need to be at the branch by 9. "I'll be there by 8:45. He nodded. "There's something else." He turned the legal pad toward her. On it, in his careful handwriting, was a name she didn't recognize. Harlan Teague. Below it, a title. Senior Partner, Teague Rowe and Associates, Chicago. "That's the firm," she said. "That's the man Grant called. 4 times in 72 hours while you were in the hospital. The 5th call was to a number registered to a shell entity that, when I traced it through 3 layers of incorporation, terminates in a holding company with registered interests in freight logistics, commercial real estate, and 1 federally flagged enterprise." He paused. "The flag is 2 years old." She stared at the name. "You're telling me Grant is connected to something the federal government is already watching?" "I'm telling you the routing number I recognize connects to something the federal government was watching when I last encountered it. Whether that investigation is still active," he stopped. "I don't know." She pulled the legal pad toward her and studied the name. Harlan Teague. She said it once, quietly, just to hear it out loud, to make it real. Then she pushed the pad back. "Bank at 8:45, she said. "What else?" "The estate attorney. Miriam Walsh. You should call her before Grant does." "Grant doesn't use Miriam." "No. But Grant's attorney does. They've had professional contact. I've seen the billing records when I managed the household accounts. If Grant moves today, his attorney calls Miriam's office by noon to establish competing claims on marital assets. You want to be in Miriam's office before that call comes in." Evelyn set her coffee down. "Get me an appointment." "Already requested, 8 o'clock. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the particular stillness of someone who had been ready for this conversation for quite some time. "Nathan," she said, "whatever happens in the next few weeks, whatever I ask you to do, I need you to tell me if we cross a line." He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Depends on the line," he said finally. "The legal one." "Everything I've done is legal," he said. "Everything I've advised has been legal. I intend to keep it that way." He picked up his pen again. "But Mrs. Ashcroft, the people on the other end of those wire transfers don't always share our commitment to staying inside the law. You understand what I'm telling you?" She did. She understood it the way you understand a diagnosis. Factually, with the particular cold clarity that comes when the thing you suspected is confirmed in plain language. She nodded once. "I'll be ready in 20 minutes, she said. She was ready in 15. Miriam Walsh's office was in Midtown, on the 34th floor of a building that smelled of money and contested estates. And Miriam herself was 64 years old and built like someone who had spent 4 decades surviving rooms full of men who underestimated her. She had short silver hair, reading glasses she wore pushed up on her head like a second set of eyes, and an expression of permanent mild skepticism that Evelyn had always found deeply comforting. She listened to Evelyn for 22 minutes without interrupting. That was unusual. Miriam was not, by nature, a listener. She was a talker, a questioner, a woman who interrupted people in order to sharpen her understanding faster. The fact that she sat still and let Evelyn lay out the entire architecture, the trust instruments, the property filing, the Chicago routing numbers, Nathan's annotated page, without a single interjection told Evelyn that Miriam understood the weight of what she was hearing. When Evelyn finished, Miriam took her reading glasses off her head and put them on her face and picked up the annotated page and read it again. "The property title," she said finally. "The estate is currently held in the Ashcroft Family Preservation Trust. Filed 14 months ago. Grant's position within the trust. Named beneficiary, not owner, not trustee." Miriam set the page down. She took her glasses off again and folded them on the desk. "Evelyn, when Grant's attorney figures out what you've done to the title structure, he is going to move for emergency injunctive relief. He'll argue constructive fraud. He'll argue that the trust was created with the intent to deprive a spouse of marital assets. Can he win? Not easily. The trust predates any formal separation proceeding. You have documentation that the restructuring was done for estate planning purposes, which is legitimate and common. But the argument will take time to defeat, and during that time, I need the household account fully out of Grant's reach." Miriam looked at her. "You're already at the bank." "Nathan's handling it. I'm here." She met Miriam's eyes. "I need you to file for separation today. Not tomorrow. Today. Before Grant's attorney makes contact with your office." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "If I file today, it triggers mandatory asset disclosure requirements for both parties. Grant will know you've moved within hours." "I know." "He'll freeze everything he can reach. He'll try. There won't be much left that he can reach." She held Miriam's gaze. "File today." Miriam picked up her pen. The bank took 45 minutes, and the particular kind of institutional friction that comes when a woman arrives to remove a powerful man's name from a significant account. There were phone calls made to supervisors. There were documents reviewed by 2 different people who kept saying they wanted to be sure everything was in order, which was bank language for "we're nervous about the man whose name we're removing." Evelyn sat in a private office chair with her hands folded in her lap and her expression completely neutral, and she answered every question in the same measured, unhurried tone, and she produced every document requested with the calm of someone who had organized those documents specifically for this moment. And by 10:45 it was done. She was in the car when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She almost didn't answer. Then something, instinct or the particular alertness she'd been carrying since midnight, made her pick up. "Mrs. Ashcroft." The voice was male, professional, with the flattened cadence of someone who had learned to give nothing away in tone. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'd appreciate a few minutes of your time." She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "How did you get this number?" "We've had it for some time," Mercer said. "I apologize for the abruptness of the call. I want to be straightforward with you. We're not looking at you, Mrs. Ashcroft. We're looking at your husband, and we believe you may have information that would be valuable to our investigation." She looked out the car window. The city moved past in the particular and different way it always did. People walking, cabs moving, the ordinary machinery of a day that was anything but ordinary. "I'll need to speak with my attorney before I talk to anyone," she said. "Of course. That's entirely your right, and I'd expect nothing less." A pause. "But I'd ask you not to wait too long. The situation is moving faster than you may realize." "Meaning what?" "Meaning the people your husband does business with in Chicago don't have a lot of patience for loose ends. And right now, Mrs. Ashcroft, I'm concerned you may be one." The call ended. She sat with the phone in her hand and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear exactly, but its close relative. The recognition of danger that isn't abstract. The awareness that the thing you're inside is larger than you calculated. She called Miriam immediately. Grant came looking for her at noon. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps in the upstairs corridor had a particular quality when he was angry, a controlled heaviness that he used the way other men used their voices. She was in the north sitting room with the door slightly ajar, and she heard him stop outside it, and then the door pushed open, and he was standing in the frame. He looked like a man whose morning had not gone the way he'd planned. His jacket was off. His collar was open. He was holding his phone in a way that suggested he had recently been using it to make calls that produced unsatisfying results. And there was something in his face that she had not seen before, a rigidity around the jaw, a flatness in the eyes. Not anger, something more tightly wound than anger. "The household account," he said. "Good morning, Grant." "Don't." He stepped into the room. "The account. What did you do?" She was sitting in the chair by the window with a book open on her knee that she had not been reading. She closed it and set it aside and looked at him with the same even expression she'd worn in the foyer the night before. "I managed a marital asset," she said, "the way I have for 14 years. You removed my access. I restructured the account within the terms of the Ashcroft Family Preservation Trust, which, if you'd reviewed the estate documents in the last 2 years, you'd have known was within my authority as trustee." His jaw tightened. "What trust?" She held his gaze and said nothing. She watched him process it, watched the information travel across his face, the way information traveled across a man who prided himself on knowing everything and had just discovered a significant gap. It took him several seconds. Then something shifted. The rigidity in his face changed character, from controlled anger to something colder and more dangerous. "You've been planning this," he said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a realization, delivered with something that almost resembled respect. "Grant," she said calmly. "Who is Harlan Teague?" The name landed the way she'd intended, like something dropped into still water, the ripple moving out fast and unmistakable. He went very still. And in that stillness she read everything she needed to read. Confirmation of what Nathan had documented. Confirmation of the calls made while she was in a hospital bed. Confirmation that the man standing in her sitting room had, at some point in the last 2 years, looked at his wife and made a calculation that involved her not surviving. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. His voice was quiet now, different. The performance was gone. "It doesn't matter where." She held his eyes. "What matters is that I know it, and that other people are beginning to ask about it too." He stared at her. And for the first time in 14 years, she saw something on Grant Holloway's face that she had never seen before. Not guilt. Grant Holloway did not do guilt. She had understood that years ago. Not fear exactly, but its functional equivalent, the expression of a man whose variables had just shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated and who was rapidly, furiously recalculating. "You don't know what you're walking into," he said. "Then tell me." "Evelyn, tell me who Harlan Teague is, Grant. Tell me what those calls were about. Tell me what you were planning while I was in that hospital." Her voice stayed level. It cost her something to keep it that way, something physical, a tightening in her chest that she breathed through without showing. "I'm giving you the chance to tell me yourself." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out. She listened to his footsteps go down the corridor. She sat in the chair and pressed her palm flat against the cover of the closed book and breathed. In, out, in, out. Then she picked up her phone and called Daniel Mercer back. Celeste Rowan came downstairs at 2 in the afternoon. She moved carefully, one hand on the banister, with the particular deliberateness of a woman in the 3rd trimester who had learned not to trust her own center of gravity. She was wearing a loose gray dress and no makeup, and looked, without the presentation of the previous afternoon, younger and less certain than she had appeared in the driveway. She found Evelyn in the kitchen because Evelyn had made it her business to be in the kitchen at 2. She had guessed, correctly, that a pregnant woman would come looking for food in the early afternoon, and she had wanted the encounter to happen on her terms rather than Celeste's. Celeste stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw her. "Mrs. Holloway," she said. Her voice was careful. "Ashcroft," Evelyn said without looking up from the counter. "I've been Evelyn Ashcroft since yesterday evening." A pause. "I'm sorry, I didn't know what Grant—" She stopped. "Didn't know what Grant told you?" Celeste moved into the kitchen slowly, as if testing whether the floor would hold her. She pulled out a stool at the kitchen island and sat. Up close, she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy, the kind of tired that came from being inside a situation longer than it was comfortable. "He told me you'd agreed," Celeste said quietly. "To the arrangement." Evelyn looked up. "What arrangement?" "That you'd discussed it. That you—" Celeste's voice flattened. "He told me a lot of things." "I'd imagine he did." Evelyn set down the glass she was holding and looked at the younger woman directly. "Celeste, how long have you been with him?" 14 months. "And before you moved in here, where were you living?" "Apartment on the Upper West Side. Grant leased it." A small hesitation on his name that told Evelyn the younger woman's relationship to that name was becoming more complicated by the hour. "Did he tell you anything about me? About my health? In the last 2 years?" Celeste frowned. "He said you had surgery. He said you recovered." "Did he say anything about what he was doing while I was in surgery?" The frown deepened. "He said he was at the hospital." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, with the careful neutrality of someone who has just confirmed something they needed confirmed without revealing the full weight of what it means. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Celeste blinked. Yes. Actually." "Sit down," Evelyn said. "I'll make you something." She made the woman a sandwich and a glass of water with lemon and set both in front of her without ceremony. And while Celeste ate, Evelyn stood at the counter and thought about timing and about how much Celeste Rowan knew and how much she didn't, and whether the younger woman was a weapon Grant had pointed at her or a person who had been pointed at along with her. She didn't have enough information yet to know. She filed it away. She would need to know soon. Grant's attorney called Miriam's office at 3:45. Miriam texted Evelyn the news with 3 words. He moved fast. Evelyn was in the back garden when the text came in, and she read it standing by the stone bench and felt the particular sensation of a plan moving into active engagement. Not fear, not adrenaline exactly, but something in between. The sharpening of attention that meant everything counted now. At 4:30, Nathan came out to find her. His face, which she had always read as composed, was carrying something she hadn't seen on it before. A tension around the mouth that he wasn't entirely successful at controlling. "What?" she said. "The storage facility in Queens," he said. "The off-site location where I kept physical copies of the trust documentation and the wire transfer records." She felt something drop in her chest. "What about it?" "I went to do a routine check this afternoon." He paused. "Someone got there first. The unit was accessed last night between midnight and 2 a.m. The physical copies are gone." She stared at him. The garden was very quiet. A truck moved somewhere on the street beyond the wall, and then silence came back. And in the silence, she stood absolutely still and felt the shape of what Nathan had just told her settle into its full dimensions. Someone had known about the storage unit. Someone had moved on it within hours of Grant coming home with Celeste, which meant the decision to move on her had not been made last night in reaction to her removing the ring. It had been made before. The timeline ran backward from this moment, and what it revealed was that Grant or someone around Grant had been watching her preparations, had known she was building something, and had waited for the right moment to begin dismantling it. She thought about the phone Nathan said had been used to send a message to Chicago. She thought about Mercer's voice on the phone. The people he does business with don't have a lot of patience for loose ends. "The digital copies," she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. "Safe, encrypted, distributed across 3 separate servers, none of which are accessible from any network connected to this house." Nathan held her eyes. "They got the paper. They didn't get the data." She breathed. "Can we reproduce the paper trail from the digital records?" "Yes, it'll take 48 hours. We have less than 48 hours before Grant's attorney files the emergency motion." She turned away from him, then turned back. "Nathan, I need you to think very carefully about whether anyone knew where that storage unit was. Anyone at all." He didn't answer immediately, which meant he was genuinely thinking and not just reassuring her. That was the right response, and she waited for it. "2 people knew," he said finally. "Me and you." She looked at him. "And the man who installed the security system on the unit," he added. "Subcontractor. I used an intermediary to hire him, but the intermediary—" He stopped. His expression shifted into something she hadn't seen before. "I used Grant's property management contact because it was faster, and I didn't think—" He stopped again. She said nothing. She let him sit with it. "I didn't think we were at risk yet," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashcroft. That was my mistake." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her without flinching, without offering excuses, with the solid, unflinching quality of a man absorbing the weight of a genuine error. "All right," she said. "It's done. We work with what we have." She turned toward the house. "Get me everything digital, organized for Mercer's office by tomorrow morning. And Nathan—" She paused without turning around. "From this point on, nobody hired through any connection to Grant. Nobody who's ever been in a room with his people. We start clean." "Understood." She walked toward the back door. The October air hit her face, cold and flat, and she moved through it without hurrying because panic was the one thing she could not afford. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She was not the woman Grant had married, accommodating and careful and perpetually one step behind. She had spent 3 years becoming someone else, and that someone else did not come apart when the variables shifted. But standing in the kitchen doorway, hand on the frame, looking into the lit interior of the house that was legally hers and practically contested, she let herself feel it for exactly 5 seconds. The full weight of what she was inside now. Not a divorce, not a betrayal. Something larger and more dangerous than either, with edges she couldn't fully see yet. 5 seconds. Then she stepped inside. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard it, Grant's voice coming from the study at the end of the hall, low and fast and tightly controlled in the way he got when the conversation was one he'd never allow anyone to overhear. She stopped. She stood on the stairs without moving, without breathing, and listened. She could only catch fragments. A name she didn't recognize, a word that sounded like documentation, and then one sentence delivered in a voice she had never heard Grant Holloway use in 14 years of marriage, a voice stripped of every layer of performance, every carefully constructed surface, a voice that was just a man talking to someone he owed something to and was afraid of. "She knows about Teague. We need to move up the timeline." The study door was solid oak. She heard nothing more. She stood on the stairs for 3 full seconds, and then she moved, quietly, up and away, toward the north corridor and the locked drawer in the sitting room, where she kept her phone in Miriam's direct line and the memory card Nathan had given her that contained, in encrypted form, every piece of evidence she had spent 3 years collecting. She moved with purpose. She moved without looking back, because now she knew without any remaining uncertainty that the man in the study was not just ending a marriage. He was managing a threat. And she had just heard, in his own unguarded voice, confirmation that she had moved up on somebody's list from inconvenience to problem, and that somewhere, in Chicago or in this house or in the particular darkness between them, a clock had just started counting down to something she did not yet have a name for but understood, with cold and absolute clarity, was coming for her whether she was ready or not. She locked the sitting room door behind her, picked up the phone, dialed. Mercer answered on the second ring. "I'm ready to talk," she said. "Tonight. Tell me where." Mercer had chosen a hotel bar in Midtown, the kind of place that was expensive enough to be discreet and busy enough that 2 people at a corner table looked like nothing more than a late business meeting. He was already there when Evelyn arrived at 8:47, sitting with his back to the wall in a booth near the far end of the room, a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched. He was younger than his voice had suggested, mid-40s, dark-haired, with the particular leanness of someone who spent a lot of time not eating regularly. He wore a plain dark suit without a tie, and he watched her cross the room with eyes that were doing what law enforcement eyes always did, cataloging, measuring, filing. She sat across from him without extending her hand. "You said the situation was moving fast," she said. "Tell me what that means." He looked at her for a moment, not rudely, but with the assessing quality of a man deciding how much he could afford to give. "It means we've had an active investigation into the organization your husband is connected to for 26 months. It means we were 4 to 6 weeks from a position to seek federal indictments. And it means that in the last 18 hours, Two individuals we've been monitoring have moved in ways that suggest they know something has shifted. He paused. We believe your husband made contact with Harlan Teague last night. Around midnight, she said. His eyes didn't change, but something in his posture adjusted fractionally. You know this how? I heard one side of a phone call. He said he needed to move up a timeline. He mentioned documentation. She held Mercer's gaze. He mentioned my name. Mercer was quiet for a moment. He picked up the water glass, looked at it, set it back down. Mrs. Ashcroft, what I'm about to tell you is information that leaves significant exposure on our end if it reaches the wrong people. I'm sharing it because I believe you're already inside this situation, whether you choose to be or not, and I'd rather you be inside it with accurate information than without it. Then tell me. The organization Harlan Teague represents is not a law firm that occasionally handles irregular clients, he said. It's the legal infrastructure for a financial network that moves money through legitimate business entities, freight, commercial real estate, 3 mid-sized banks in the Midwest, on behalf of a criminal syndicate operating across 7 states. Your husband has been a financial architect for that network for approximately 4 years, possibly longer. He let that settle. The money he manages for them is not investment capital. It's proceeds from narcotics distribution, labor trafficking, and municipal contract fraud. She sat with it. The bar moved around them. Low music, the clatter of glasses, 2 men at the counter laughing at something. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary night in a city that contained, apparently, the information that her husband was a money launderer for organized crime. How long have you known about Grant specifically? She said. 2 years. And his connection to my surgery. Mercer's expression shifted. Not much. Just enough. Explain what you mean. She told him about the calls to Teague during her hospitalization, about the survival clause in the financial agreement, about what Nathan had inferred from the routing records. She spoke concisely, without editorializing, laying the information out the way she would lay documents on a table, flat and in order. When she finished, Mercer was looking at her with an expression that she read, with some difficulty, as controlled alarm. We were not aware of the survival clause, he said. Then you need to be. Mrs. Ashcroft, he stopped, pressed his hand flat on the table briefly, the gesture of a man organizing his thoughts under pressure. The reason I called you today, the reason I moved on contacting you now rather than waiting, is that we intercepted a communication yesterday evening from a number we've associated with Teague's operation to a number we've been unable to source. The content of that communication was brief. He looked at her directly. It referenced your name, and the word used in conjunction with your name was a term this network uses when they've identified someone as a liability requiring active management. She held his eyes and didn't blink. Meaning, they intend to harm me. Meaning, we believe they're evaluating options. He leaned forward slightly. Which is why I'm here, and why I need to ask you something directly. The documentation you've been building, the financial records, the trust instruments, the wire transfer evidence, is any of it in a location that's physically accessible to someone connected to your husband? She thought about the storage unit in Queens, the empty shelves, the missing paper trail. It was, she said. As of last night, it isn't. Something crossed his face. They already moved. The physical copies, yes. He sat back, ran his thumb along the edge of the water glass. Do you have digital backup? Yes, encrypted, off-site. I'm going to need that, Mrs. Ashcroft, all of it. Whatever you have. And I'm going to need it in a way that establishes clean chain of custody for federal use, which means, with your attorney present, formally documented, transferred through a process my office controls. He paused. Can you do that? Tomorrow morning, she said. My attorney's office, 9 a.m. He nodded. Then, is there anyone in your immediate environment, anyone with regular access to your home, your communications, your movements, whose loyalty you're not completely certain of? She thought of Nathan. She thought of what he'd told her, the routing number, the previous employer, the detail that would not explain itself. She thought of his mistake with the storage unit, the subcontractor hired through a property management contact that ran, somewhere in its chain, back to Grant. She thought about how much she trusted Nathan Cole, and whether trust was the same as certainty, and whether she had ever, in 3 years of careful preparation, genuinely interrogated the difference. I'll review my situation tonight, she said, which was not an answer, and Mercer heard that it wasn't an answer, and he let it go. She drove home in the back of a car she'd called herself, watching the city move past the windows. And she felt it. Not panic, nothing as useful as panic, but a particular species of dread that lived specifically in the recognition that the ground you thought you were standing on had been, in some fundamental way, less solid than you believed. She had been building. She had been careful. She had spent 3 years being precise and deliberate and controlled. And she had been right about almost everything, but she had let one person close enough to make one mistake that had cost her the physical documentation. And now federal agents were using words like active management and liability. And somewhere in this city, a man named Harlan Teague had received a phone call from her husband, and the timeline of something she didn't yet fully understand had been moved forward. She pressed her fingertips against the cold window glass and breathed. The house was lit when she arrived, not the ordinary evening lighting, too many windows, too many rooms. She saw it before the car pulled fully into the drive and felt something tighten in her stomach. She went in through the side entrance rather than the front. Old habit or instinct or something between the two. She moved through the rear corridor, past the kitchen, and stopped. Nathan was in the kitchen. So was a man she had never seen before. Heavy-set, 50s, wearing a jacket that was slightly too formal for 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in a private residence. He was standing near the island with his hands in his jacket pockets and a posture that said he was accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. Nathan looked up when she came in. His face was controlled, too controlled, in the specific way that told her something was wrong. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. "This is a colleague of mine. He wanted to speak with you." The man turned. He had a broad, flat face and small eyes that moved over her with efficient assessment. "Mrs. Holloway?" he said. "Ashcroft," she said. Her voice came out even. She didn't know how. "Who are you?" "My name isn't important right now." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes in any meaningful way. "What's important is that you've had a busy day, and some of the people you've been meeting with tonight have put some folks in a difficult position. We'd like to talk about how to simplify that." She looked at Nathan. Nathan's jaw was tight. He wasn't looking at her directly, which told her he was either controlled by this man's presence or controlled by something else she didn't yet understand. And in this moment, the difference between those two things mattered enormously, and she had no way to know which it was. "Nathan," she said quietly, "please leave the room." "I prefer he stays," the man said pleasantly. "I wasn't asking you," she said, and looked only at Nathan. Nathan moved toward the door. The man let him go, which told her Nathan's presence had been informational rather than functional. He was supposed to make her feel outnumbered, not actually contain her. She filed this, kept her face neutral. When Nathan was gone, she looked at the man. "Say what you came to say." "The documentation you've been collecting, financial records, property instruments, transfer logs." He tilted his head slightly. "We want the digital copies, all locations, all formats, passwords, and encryption keys. You deliver those to a location we specify, and this whole situation gets a lot quieter for you." "And if I don't?" He smiled again, the same smile. "Mrs. Holloway, your husband has been very patient with you. The people he works with are less patient. They want this resolved before it creates problems that can't be resolved. You understand what I mean?" "I understand what you mean," she said. "I'd like you to leave my house." "This isn't," he started. "The property title to this estate is held in the Ashcroft Family Preservation Trust, of which I am sole trustee. You are on my property without invitation. I'm asking you to leave." She held his gaze without moving. "And the next time someone enters this house uninvited, I will have that fact on record with the FBI field office before the door closes behind them." The smile disappeared. He looked at her with the small eyes that had been doing their efficient assessment since she walked in, and she looked back at him without flinching, and the kitchen was very quiet. "You've got 24 hours, he said. He walked out without another word. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the front door close. Then she put both hands flat on the island counter and leaned on them and let herself shake for exactly 30 seconds. The real physical response her body had been holding back for the last 4 hours. The trembling that came from adrenaline and the sustained effort of being controlled in the presence of a threat. She let it move through her. She didn't try to stop it. She just waited for it to pass. Then she straightened up and went to find Nathan. He was in the corridor outside the kitchen, standing against the wall with his arms crossed and his head down. When she appeared, he looked up, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen on him before in 11 years. Not guilt, exactly, because Nathan Cole was not a man who did guilt in the common way. More like a man who had miscalculated the weight of something and was now standing underneath it. "How did he get in?" she said. "I let him in." The words came out flat and direct. No softening, no construction around them. "He came to the back door 40 minutes ago. He told me he was a federal contact. He had identification that looked, I verified the badge format. It looked legitimate." She stared at him. "Nathan." "I know." He uncrossed his arms, let them hang at his sides. "It wasn't federal ID. I understood that about 5 minutes after I let him in, when the questions he was asking didn't match any federal protocol I've ever encountered. But by then," he stopped. "By then he was already inside." "Yes." She looked at the ceiling for a moment, looked back at him. "Does he know anything he didn't know before he came in?" "No, I gave him nothing. I told him you'd be home, and I waited for you." He met her eyes. "That's the truth, Mrs. Ashcroft." She studied his face. The thing about Nathan Cole was that she had always been able to read him, not because he was transparent, he was not, but because she had spent 11 years learning his particular frequencies. And what she was reading now was not deception. It was something rarer and more uncomfortable. A man who had made a genuine mistake and was standing in front of it without cover. "The previous employer," she said. "The one you won't tell me about. Does it connect to the routing numbers? Does it connect to Chicago?" He held her gaze for a long moment. "Not directly," he said. "I worked in financial compliance. Private sector, not government. I encountered the routing structure in that context. There's no connection to Teague's organization. I would not have stayed in this house for 11 years if there were. But there's something you're not telling me." "There is something I haven't told you," he said carefully. "Not because it's a threat to you, because it's mine, and I've kept it that way. But if you need me to tell you—" "Not tonight," she said, because tonight she needed to be able to trust him, and the information he was protecting was either going to break that trust or not. And she couldn't afford to find out at 11:15 on a night when a man with false federal credentials had just stood in her kitchen making threats. "Tomorrow. Tell me tomorrow." He nodded. "The man who just left," she said. "He'll be back, or someone like him." "Yes." "I need you to sleep in the house tonight, not the cottage." "Already planned on it." She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the north room with her phone in her hand and the encrypted memory card on the nightstand, and her mind doing the thing it did under extreme pressure, not shutting down, but narrowing, stripping away everything that wasn't immediately essential. She had built a plan over 3 years, and the plan was intact in its digital architecture. But the physical evidence was gone, and an uninvited man had been inside her home, and the FBI had told her she was a named liability on someone's list, and her husband had moved up a timeline that she didn't fully understand yet. She needed to think about what she was most afraid of, and why. She was not afraid of Grant. She had moved past fear of Grant sometime in the last 12 hours and into something colder. The particular absence of feeling for someone you have accepted as an adversary. She was not afraid of the legal battle because the legal battle was a territory she had spent 3 years mapping. What she was afraid of, and she made herself name it, sitting in that room because unnamed fears were the ones that crippled you, was the possibility that something she had trusted was compromised in a way she couldn't see yet. Nathan's mistake. The storage unit. The man with the false credentials who had somehow known to come tonight, to this house, within hours of her meeting with Mercer. She thought about that timing. She thought about it very carefully. And then she thought about the hotel bar in Midtown, and the booth in the corner, and Daniel Mercer's careful voice, and a cold, ugly thought moved through her that she did not want to have, but could not, in good conscience, dismiss. She had told Mercer she had digital copies. She had told him her attorney's office, 9 a.m. tomorrow. She had told him enough to know where she would be and when and what she would be carrying. And 4 hours later, a man with false federal credentials had appeared in her home to ask for the same digital copies. She sat very still with this thought. She turned it over. She examined it from the angles she didn't want to examine. She asked herself whether she was being paranoid in a way that was counterproductive, and she asked herself whether paranoia was really the appropriate word for a response to an evening in which every piece of bad news had arrived slightly faster than the preceding piece, in a sequence that suggested coordination. She didn't have enough to know. That was the honest answer. She did not have enough to know whether Daniel Mercer was exactly what he presented himself as, or whether the situation was darker and stranger than she'd understood when she dialed his number at the top of the stairs. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going to Miriam's office with the encrypted memory card at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Because if someone had a reason to be there ahead of her, being there at 9 o'clock with the only copy of 3 years of evidence was a risk she could not take. She picked up her phone and called Miriam. It was nearly midnight. Miriam answered on the third ring with the voice of a woman who had been sleeping but was now not, and who was not particularly happy about either. "Change of plan?" Evelyn said. "Tomorrow morning, not your office." A short silence. "Evelyn, what happened?" "I'll explain tomorrow. I need a location that no one we've spoken to in the last 24 hours would associate with either of us. Somewhere neutral." Miriam was quiet for a moment. Then, "My sister has a law office in Hoboken. Small firm, immigration practice, nothing that touches any of this. I'll call her tonight." "Thank you." "Evelyn?" Miriam's voice shifted slightly. "Are you safe right now?" She looked around the north room, the locked door, the nightstand, the memory card. "For tonight," she said. She ended the call. She lay down on the bed without removing her clothes, on top of the covers, with her phone in her hand and the memory card in her closed fist. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought, and the hours moved, and somewhere in the house Grant Holloway was either sleeping or making more phone calls she would not hear, and somewhere in Chicago Harlan Teague existed in a world she was only beginning to understand the edges of, and somewhere a clock she couldn't see was counting down to a deadline she couldn't define. At 2:17 in the morning, her phone lit with an incoming text from a number she didn't recognize. No area code she knew. The message was 4 words: "Check your husband's study." She stared at it. Read it 3 more times. The sender was already unreachable. The number returned nothing when she called it back, not even a ringtone. She lay still for 30 seconds. Then she got up. She moved through this house in the dark, barefoot, without turning on lights, navigating by the ambient glow of exterior lighting through the windows. The house was quiet. She could hear nothing from the master suite as she passed it. No breathing, no movement, which meant Grant was either deeply asleep or not there. She didn't stop to determine which. The study was at the end of the east hall. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly and stood in the doorway listening, then reached inside for the lamp on the side table rather than the overhead light. The room looked exactly as it always had. Bookshelves, desk, the oil painting on the far wall that Grant had paid too much for at auction 5 years ago as a gesture he'd called investment, and she had always called compensation. She stood in the doorway and looked carefully at everything, the way you looked at a room when you were trying to see what was wrong rather than what was right. Then she saw the desk. Grant was meticulous about his desk. It was one of his consistent characteristics. Every surface arranged with precision, every document in its place, the particular order of a man who needed to feel control in his physical environment. She had walked past that desk 10,000 times, and it had always looked the same. Tonight, the center drawer was not fully closed. She crossed the room and stood in front of the desk, looked at the drawer without touching it, looked at the surface of the desk, everything in its usual position, nothing visibly disturbed. She opened the center drawer. Inside was the ordinary desk furniture. Pens, a letter opener, a small notepad. And underneath the notepad, placed there deliberately with a care that was different from the ordinary careful arrangement of Grant's things, a manila envelope she had never seen before. She picked it up. It was thin, not sealed. She opened it and removed the contents, 2 sheets of paper and a photograph. The photograph showed a woman she didn't know. Younger, dark-haired, photographed from a distance in what looked like a parking garage. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting she didn't recognize, was a date from 8 months ago and a 2-word notation she didn't immediately understand. She put the photograph down and read the first sheet. It was a single page of typed text, dense and formal, in the manner of an internal memorandum, with no letterhead and no signature. It referenced a financial instrument she didn't recognize, a shell entity she had not encountered in any of her 3 years of documentation, and a property address in a suburb of Chicago that meant nothing to her. She read the second sheet and felt the air go out of her. It was a timeline, a precise, dated, itemized timeline of decisions and actions taken over the preceding 4 years by Grant Holloway in relation to his marriage to Evelyn Ashcroft. It was written with the detached efficiency of someone documenting a project. No emotional language, no embellishment, just dates and actions and outcomes. And as she read it in the small lamplight of her husband's study, standing in the house that was legally hers, she understood 3 things simultaneously that she had not understood before. First, Grant had begun formally planning to extract himself from their marriage, financially, legally, and in other ways the timeline made oblique but unmistakable reference to not 2 years ago, but 4. Before her illness, before Celeste, before any of it. The marriage had already been a business arrangement he was winding down before she had begun to suspect it was anything other than a troubled but intact marriage. Second, the financial structure he had been building in parallel to the one she had been building, quietly, through Teague's network, through layers of instruments she had not found in her 3 years of documentation, was significantly larger and more sophisticated than anything she had uncovered. What she had been collecting was the visible edge of something that went much deeper, and the evidence she had assembled, as thorough as it was, represented perhaps a quarter of the actual architecture. Third, and this was the one that made her stand motionless in the lamplight for a full 30 seconds before she could breathe properly again. The timeline contained a name, an entry from 14 months ago, coinciding precisely with the month Celeste Rowan had entered Grant's life. The entry referenced a meeting. The attendees listed were Grant, Harlan Teague, and one other person identified by initials and a professional title. The initials were NC. The title listed was Asset. NC. She put the papers down on the desk, set them very carefully, side by side, the way you set down something that might break if you handled it wrong. She put the photograph beside them. She stood over the desk in the lamplight and felt something move through her that was unlike anything she had felt before in this process. Not the controlled dread of the meeting with Mercer, not the cold anger of the foyer, not the disciplined fear of the kitchen. Something that had no clean name because it was made of too many things at once. Betrayal and disorientation and the particular vertigo of understanding that the floor you built your entire strategy on had, at some point you couldn't precisely identify, been placed there by someone who intended for you to fall through it. Nathan Cole, Asset, 14 months ago. A meeting with Grant and Harlan Teague. She had trusted him for 11 years. She had built this plan in partnership with him. She had given him access to every piece of documentation, every account structure, every legal instrument. She had told him about Mercer tonight. She had told him the 9 o'clock meeting at Miriam's office. She stood in the study and she did not move for a long time. When she finally did move, she did not go back upstairs. She went to the rear of the house and out the back door into the cold October air, and she stood in the garden in her bare feet on the stone path, and she breathed, and the cold came up through the soles of her feet and into her legs, and she let it because the cold was real and specific and grounded her in the physical present in a way she needed right now. She needed to feel something external and definite because everything internal was moving too fast and in directions she hadn't built a map for. She thought about 11 years. She thought about every conversation, every document passed between them, every timeline and trust instrument and account structure assembled in the careful, methodical partnership she had believed was the one solid thing in an otherwise unstable marriage. She thought about his face in the kitchen tonight, the controlled expression, the too tight jaw, the way he'd avoided her eyes directly. And she reread that face now against what she'd just found on the desk. And what she found there was not the face of a man who'd made a mistake with a subcontractor. It was the face of a man who had been managing 2 parallel relationships simultaneously for at least 14 months. One with her, one with the people who had sent a man with false federal credentials to her door. She pressed her hand over her mouth, not to prevent sound. She wasn't going to make a sound, she was not going to give this moment that, but because she needed to feel her own hand, the physical reality of it. She was here. She was standing in this garden. She was still in this. The encrypted memory card was upstairs. Nathan had helped her build the encryption protocol. Nathan knew the structure of the files. Nathan knew that the backup was distributed across 3 servers, and he knew the general architecture of that distribution because she had explained it to him 3 weeks ago when they'd set it up together. Whether he knew enough to access the files without her, she didn't know. She didn't know how deep it went. She didn't know whether he had been feeding information incrementally or whether the storage unit in Queens had been the deliberate sabotage of a man who had been waiting for the right moment. She didn't know whether the man with the false federal credentials had come tonight because Nathan had called someone after she spoke to him in the corridor, or whether the timing was coincidental, or whether coincidence was even a concept that applied to anything that had happened in the last 24 hours. She didn't know, and not knowing was the most dangerous state she had ever been in. She needed the memory card. She needed to move it tonight, before morning, before anyone had a chance to act on whatever Nathan may or may not have communicated. She needed to do it without Nathan knowing she was doing it. And she needed to do it alone, which meant she was, for the first time in this entire process, completely without the one ally she had built everything around. She turned and walked back into the house, up the stairs, into the north room. She took the memory card from the nightstand and put it inside the lining of her coat, an interior pocket she'd had sewn in herself 18 months ago for reasons she'd told herself at the time were precautionary. She put the coat on. She picked up her phone and her keys. She thought about calling Miriam. She thought about calling Mercer, and then stopped at that thought, hard, because she still didn't know what Mercer was. Still didn't know whether the timing of his call and the timing of the evening's events constituted coincidence or coordination, and she could not afford another mistake built on a trust she hadn't earned with evidence. She was alone. For the first time in 3 years, she was genuinely, completely alone. No Nathan. No Miriam, until she could get somewhere safe enough to call her. No federal agent whose allegiance she could verify. Just herself in a coat with a hidden pocket and 3 years of evidence compressed onto a card smaller than her thumbnail. She went to the door, put her hand on the frame, looked back at the room, the chair by the window, the nightstand, the locked drawer, the small geography of the retreat she'd built inside an increasingly hostile house. Then she heard it. From downstairs, not from the direction of the master suite, not from Nathan's room, but from the study. The study she had left with the lamp on and the papers spread across the desk. The sound of the lamp being switched off. And then footsteps, moving away from the study toward the back of the house, quiet and deliberate and unhurried. Someone had been in the study while she was standing in the garden. Someone had seen what she'd found. And now that someone, Grant, Nathan, the man with the false credentials who should have left and perhaps had not, was moving through the back of her house in the dark. She stood in the doorway of the north room and didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped. The house was absolutely silent, and then her phone lit up in her hand. Not a call, not a text, but an app notification from the security system Nathan had installed on the property 18 months ago. A notification that told her, in the flat language of automated systems, that the rear garden gate had just been opened from the inside. Someone was leaving, or someone was letting someone else in. She moved. She moved fast and without sound. Down the corridor, away from the staircase, toward the north exit that opened onto the side passage between the main house and the garden wall. She had learned this house the way you learned a thing you might need to escape, not as a home, but as a structure, a set of distances and angles and alternate routes. The north exit was a door that most people in the household didn't use because it opened onto a narrow stone passage that led nowhere particularly convenient. That was exactly why she used it now. She hit the door at speed, pushed through it, and the October air came at her hard and cold, and she was moving before her eyes fully adjusted to the dark outside. The passage was narrow, stone wall on one side, the brick exterior of the house on the other. And she moved along it with one hand trailing the brick for orientation, her bare feet on cold stone and her coat pulled tight and the memory card against her ribs where she could feel it with every breath. She reached the end of the passage and stopped, pressed her back against the wall, looked. The garden was empty. The gate in the far wall, the rear gate, the one the security notification had flagged, was standing open about 8 inches, the way it stood when someone had passed through recently and let it swing rather than pulling it fully shut behind them. The garden lighting was ambient and low, and beyond the gate was the service alley that ran between the property and the building behind it, and the service alley was dark. She looked back at the house. The study window on the ground floor was dark. The kitchen window was dark. One window on the second floor, the master suite, showed a thin line of light under the curtain that hadn't been there when she'd passed it 20 minutes ago. Grant was awake. She stood in the passage entrance and made a decision in about 4 seconds that she understood was not a safe decision, and made it anyway because the alternative was going back inside a house where the geometry of trust had collapsed completely, and she had no way to determine who was dangerous and who was simply scared, and whether those two categories still overlapped in the ways she'd thought. She went through the garden, across the stone path, through the gate. The service alley was narrow and smelled of damp concrete and the particular urban dark that comes from buildings blocking all ambient light. She stopped inside the gate and pulled it shut behind her and listened. Nothing moved. Somewhere at the far end of the alley, she could see the faint orange wash of a streetlight, and she moved toward it, keeping to the center of the alley, her feet registering every cold irregularity of the concrete beneath them. She reached the street, stood under the streetlight for exactly long enough to pull her phone from her coat pocket and open a car app. With hands that were steady, she made them steady because trembling was something she could not afford right now, and her body understood this even if it objected. A car was 4 minutes away. She stepped back from the light and waited against the building face, and 4 minutes had never been so long. She counted her own heartbeat, fast but regular. A little too fast. She breathed against it deliberately. In for 4, out for 6, the pattern the physical therapist had taught her in a different crisis for a different kind of survival. And by the time she saw the headlights of the car turning onto the street, her pulse had come down enough that she felt functional again. She got in, gave an address she chose at random, a 24-hour diner in Chelsea she'd eaten at once 3 years ago, and remembered only because it was large and anonymous, and the kind of place where a woman sitting alone at 2:30 in the morning was unremarkable. The driver didn't look at her. She sat in the back and watched the city through the window and thought. The timeline on the desk. NC asset. 14 months. She needed to know what she was working with before she made another move. She needed to know whether Nathan's entry in that document meant full compromise, meaning he had been feeding information actively to Teague's network for over a year, or whether it meant something more ambiguous, a contact, a meeting, something she could still work around if she understood its shape. Because the difference between those two things determined everything about what she could salvage and what she had already lost. She needed information she didn't have, and the only people she could think of who might have it were Mercer, whom she didn't trust enough to call in the dark from the back of a car, and Celeste Rowan, whom she had looked at across a kitchen island earlier that evening and decided was a person rather than a weapon. She pulled out her phone. She had Celeste's number because Nathan had given it to her when Grant brought the woman home, presented as a household management matter, in case you need to coordinate schedules. She had stored it under a neutral label and not used it. She called it now. It rang 6 times. She almost hung up. Then, "Hello?" The voice was thick with sleep and something else, a congestion, as if she'd been crying recently or was coming down with something, young, uncertain. "Celeste, it's Evelyn Ashcroft." A silence. Then, It's 3 in the morning. I know. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She kept her voice low and even. "How much do you know about what Grant does? Professionally? The specifics." Another silence, longer. She heard Celeste sit up, the rustle of bedding, a small intake of breath. "He told me he's in finance, investment management. Did he ever mention a man named Harlan Teague?" The silence this time was different, shaped differently. The silence of recognition rather than ignorance. Celeste. There were calls sometimes. When Grant thought I wasn't nearby, he said Teague was a business attorney. He told me it was nothing I needed to worry about. A pause. He says that about a lot of things. Did he ever say anything about me being ill, about my surgery last year? I told you what he told me. He said you recovered. Did he seem concerned? During those days, was he... He was gone, Celeste said quietly. Those 3 days. He told me he was at the hospital with you, but he came back to the apartment at night. All 3 nights. He said the hospital was... He said you had people there. A breath. I didn't question it. I know I should have. Evelyn sat with this. The car moved through empty nighttime streets, the driver oblivious, the city indifferent. Celeste, the apartment he leased for you on the Upper West Side. Who managed the lease? A property company. I don't remember the name exactly. It had a blue logo. Did you ever meet anyone from the property company in person? Once, when I signed the initial paperwork. A man, heavy set, older. He had a Chicago accent. A pause. I remember because Grant introduced him as an associate and then corrected himself. Said he was a property manager. The man with the false federal credentials. The same description exactly. Heavy set. The formality of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in the room. He had arranged Celeste's apartment. He had been in Evelyn's kitchen tonight. He was the connector between Grant's domestic arrangements and Teague's operational structure, which meant Grant's relationship with Celeste was not separate from his Chicago connections. It had been arranged through them. Celeste herself had been, in some capacity, placed. I need to ask you something harder, Evelyn said, and I need you to be honest even if the honest answer is complicated. All right? Did you know, when you became involved with Grant, that he was married to someone who was ill? The silence stretched long enough that Evelyn thought she might have lost the call. Then, yes, Celeste said very quietly. He told me you were sick. He told me the marriage had been over for years. He told me... She stopped. He said a lot of things that I chose to believe because I wanted to. Her voice had changed. Something in it had dropped its guard. I'm 29 years old, and I made a lot of choices based on what I wanted to be true. I know what that makes me. It makes you someone he used, Evelyn said, the same way he used everything else. The diner was visible through the windshield now. She thanked the driver, got out, and stood on the sidewalk in the cold with her phone still at her ear. I'm going to need you to do something for me, she said. In the morning. It'll be difficult, and Grant will be angry, and I can't fully protect you from either of those things. But I need what you have. What do you think I have? Documents, letters, private agreements he may have shared with you or that you may have seen, anything that references Teague or Chicago or financial instruments you didn't understand, anything he kept at the apartment or brought to the house. A long pause. There's a folder, Celeste said slowly. He kept it in the apartment. I asked him about it once. He took it back to the office, he said, but I kept one page. I don't know why. Something felt wrong, and I kept one page. Evelyn closed her eyes, opened them. One page of what? It looked like an agreement between 2 parties. One of them was a company name I didn't recognize. The other was Grant's name. It had a clause in it about spousal death benefits, about what happened to certain accounts if Grant's spouse predeceased him. Her voice dropped. I didn't understand it at the time. I think I do now. Celeste, I need that page. I know. A breath. I know you do. She went into the diner, took a booth in the back corner, ordered coffee. She didn't plan to drink, and sat with her back to the wall and her coat still on, and the memory card against her ribs and her phone on the table in front of her. She looked at the table surface for a long moment. Then she called Miriam. Miriam answered in 2 rings, which meant she hadn't really been asleep. Where are you? Chelsea, a diner. I'm safe. She paused. Nathan is compromised. I found documentation. I don't know the full extent yet, but I need you to assume that anything he knew, they knew. Anything I told him tonight after 9 p.m., the 9 o'clock meeting at my office. Don't go there tomorrow. I'm already not going there. A pause. Evelyn, the sister's office in Hoboken, 9:30 instead of 9. That's still work. Yes. She looked at the door of the diner, then back at the table. I have one more piece coming, from Celeste Rowan. She has a document that may directly reference the survival clause. Miriam was silent for a moment. If she has that and she's willing to hand it over, she's willing. Then we go in tomorrow morning with enough to file a federal evidence declaration before Grant's attorney can get the emergency motion in front of a judge. Another pause. Evelyn, I need to say something, and I need you to hear it. Say it. If Nathan's in the document you found, if he's listed the way you described, then everything he helped you build is potentially tainted. A defense attorney will argue he was a planted operative, and anything he touched is fruit of a poisoned tree, Evelyn said. I know. Which means the digital copies are at risk of being excluded. Which means Celeste's document may be the cleanest piece of evidence you have, original in her possession, obtained independently. Miriam's voice was careful and deliberate, the voice of a woman who is working very hard in the middle of the night. How stable is she? Stable enough. She thought of Celeste's voice, the young woman who had made choices based on what she wanted to believe and now had to live in the truth she'd been avoiding. Maybe more than I expected. She stayed in the diner until 5. Then she called another car and went to a hotel 6 blocks from Miriam's sister's Hoboken office, a mid-range business hotel where she paid cash at the desk and gave a name that was not her own, and the night clerk looked at her bare feet and her coat and her exhausted face and did not ask a single question because New York night clerks had seen everything and responded to all of it with the same magnificently indifferent professionalism. She slept 2 hours. Hard, black, dreamless sleep. Her body simply shut down and restarted, and when her phone alarm pulled her back at 7:15, she felt not rested, but functional, which was enough. She showered. She called downstairs and asked for toiletries and was given a plastic bag containing a comb and travel toothpaste and hotel slippers, which she put on because her feet had not recovered from the stone passage and the concrete alley and the Chelsea pavement. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. Not the composed armored woman of the marble foyer, not the performed perfection of 14 years of Manhattan marriage. Just herself. Her actual face, without the construction. 42 years old and bare and tired and extremely clear-eyed, which was perhaps the most honest she had looked in a decade. She called Celeste at 7:30. "Can you get out of the house," she said, "without Grant seeing you? He leaves for his office at 8. He's been doing it every morning since we got here, even yesterday." A pause. "He's on the phone constantly. He seems—" She stopped. "Scared," Evelyn said. "Yes." "Wait until he's gone. Take the document and take whatever you have, anything you kept, any record of anything that felt wrong, and take a car to Hoboken. I'll send you the address." "Evelyn," Celeste's voice shifted. "The baby. If this goes the way I think it's going to go, Grant, the legal situation, what happens to—" "Your son will be protected," Evelyn said. "Not because of Grant, because of you. I'll make sure of it." She meant it. She had thought about it. In the 2 hours of sleep and in the moments before it, the innocent child who was the only entirely blameless person in the entire architecture of her husband's deceits. "Trust me on that." A pause. Then, "All right." She texted Miriam the update. She sat by the hotel window with the slippers on her feet and the memory card in her hand, and she looked out at the New Jersey morning, flatter than Manhattan, less dramatic, the kind of gray autumn sky that promised nothing and delivered nothing. And she thought about the day ahead. The Hoboken office, the evidence declaration, the federal filing that Mercer had described as capable of linking Grant's legal team directly to organized crime. And Nathan. She had not resolved Nathan. She did not know what to do about Nathan, which was an unusual position for her because she had always known what to do about everything, or had known how to build toward knowing, which was the next best thing. But Nathan was 11 years, and the timeline document had said asset and not operative and not informant, and the precise language of the distinction might matter enormously or might matter not at all, and she could not know which without more information than she currently had. She was still thinking about it when her phone rang. Not a number she recognized, not Mercer's number. She stared at it for one ring, then answered. "Mrs. Ashcroft." A voice she had not heard before. Older, carefully modulated, with a faint flattening of vowels that was Midwestern in origin. "My name is Harlan Teague." She did not speak. She sat completely still with the phone against her ear and felt something move through her chest that was not fear and not anger, but the precise sensation of arriving at a border you had been walking toward and finding it right there in front of you. "I've been wanting to speak with you directly," Teague continued, with the measured pleasantness of a man who had learned to make dangerous conversations sound routine. "I think there's been some unnecessary escalation in the last 24 hours, and I think two intelligent people can arrive at a resolution that's better for everyone involved." "I'm listening," she said. "Because you always listened. You gathered information even when you were talking to the person who wanted you to stop existing. You have documentation you believe is incriminating. Some of it has already been recovered. Some of it is still in your possession. We both know this." A pause. "What I'd like you to understand is that the documentation tells a partial story. Without context, it will cause significant legal and financial disruption. To your husband, yes, but also to a number of other parties whose exposure could create problems considerably larger than a domestic separation proceeding." Another pause. "Problems that could, given the current legal environment, create complications for you personally." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Teague?" "I'm giving you information," he said pleasantly, "the way one professional gives information to another." "Then give me this information. Why did you meet with Nathan Cole 14 months ago?" A beat. Short, but there. "I think you should ask Nathan that directly." "I'm asking you." "Mrs. Ashcroft, why is his name in a document in my husband's desk with the word asset beside it? What does that mean? What did you need from him, and what did you pay for it?" The pleasantness drained from his voice, not replaced by anger, replaced by something more stripped and direct. The voice underneath the voice. "Nathan Cole came to us. Not the other way. He had information about your financial restructuring that he believed at the time was worth something to us. He was wrong about that. He was also wrong about several other things." A pause. "He is not our asset, Mrs. Ashcroft. He was an approach we declined. The meeting in that document was the only meeting. Check the date. Check what happened in the following months. You'll find no further contact." She sat with this, turned it over the way she turned everything over, looked for the places where it was constructed rather than true. She couldn't find them, which didn't mean they weren't there. It meant she needed more time than she had. "What do you want, Mr. Teague?" she said. "I want you to stop," he said simply. "Stop the federal cooperation. Stop the evidence gathering. Take the marital settlement your husband's attorney is prepared to offer, which is, I can assure you, substantially more generous than what a contested divorce would produce, and remove yourself from this situation. That's all." A pause. "You're a smart woman. You built something impressive in 3 years working mostly alone. I respect that, but you're standing at the edge of something that has nothing to do with you, and the people inside it are not people who accept interference." She looked out the hotel window at the gray New Jersey sky. She thought about a marble foyer and a wedding ring placed on a console table. She thought about a hospital bed and 3 days of recovery and peonies in a vase. She thought about a file folder on a study desk with her name in it, and a timeline of her own marriage written in the detached language of a project to be wound down, and a pregnant woman eating a sandwich in her kitchen, and a man named Harlan Teague who was on the phone with her right now because he was afraid of what she had. "No," she said. Silence. "No," she said again. "I won't stop. I won't take the settlement. I won't remove myself." She kept her voice level, because level was the only tone this conversation deserved. "You should know that the federal contact I've been in communication with is not the only contact. The documentation I have, the digital copies your man didn't reach, has already been shared with a second party, not Miriam Walsh. Someone else. Someone neither you nor Grant knows about. This was not entirely true and not entirely false. She had prepared for this contingency in theory, if not yet in execution, which was close enough for a conversation with a man who was also, she understood, managing the truth carefully. If anything happens to me or to anyone connected to me, everything goes directly to federal prosecutors in 2 jurisdictions simultaneously. Mrs. Ashcroft, and you should know one more thing." She stood up from the chair, put her feet flat on the floor in the hotel slippers, stood at the window and looked out. "Celeste Rowan is not in your architecture anymore. She's in mine. What she has comes with me to Hoboken this morning, and what the two of us have together is considerably more than a partial story. She paused. "We're done talking, Mr. Teague." She ended the call. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the window glass and felt the cold come through the pane and breathed against the shaking until it slowed and then stopped. Her heart was hitting her ribs with a force she felt physically, a rhythmic insistence that said you just did something you cannot undo, and she knew this was true, and she stood at the window until the knowledge settled into something she could carry. Her phone rang again. Different number. She answered immediately because the timing told her it mattered. "Evelyn," Nathan's voice, strained in a way she had never heard it. "I need to tell you something. I know you found the document. I know what it looks like." He was speaking quickly, in a way Nathan Cole never spoke. Nathan spoke in measured, organized sentences because his mind organized information before releasing it. This was different. This was a man running out of time, and he knew it. "The meeting with Teague 14 months ago, I went to him. He's right that it was one meeting and that nothing came from it, but that's not the whole story, and you deserve the whole story." A breath. "I went to that meeting because I was trying to build a case against him, against the network. I had contacts from my previous employment who told me Teague was building towards something that would hurt you, specifically you. And I was trying to get ahead of it, and I did it without telling you because I didn't want you to know how close it was." She stood at the window. "Nathan, I know. I should have told you. Every decision I made that I didn't tell you about was the wrong decision. I know that now." A pause. "The storage unit. The subcontractor. That was genuine stupidity, not sabotage. I have been on your side for 11 years, and I have made mistakes, and some of them have cost us, and I cannot tell you how—" He stopped. "They have me, Evelyn, the man from last night. He's been here since 4 a.m. I'm in the cottage. He's outside the door. I don't know if my phone is—" The line went dead. She stared at the phone. 40 seconds of absolute stillness in which she stood at the hotel window and looked at the gray sky and felt the shape of the morning rearrange itself around this new variable. If Nathan was being held in the cottage, it meant Teague's people had decided the conversation with her had not produced the result they wanted and had moved to pressure, which meant they were not in fact going to wait, which meant the timeline she had given herself, Hoboken, 9:30, Celeste, the documents, the evidence declaration, had just compressed into something significantly more urgent. She grabbed her coat, checked the memory card, typed a fast message to Miriam. "Moving faster. Status on Nathan Cole. He may need extraction from the estate property. Don't call. Don't go to the house. I'm coming." She was at the door when her phone lit one final time. A text from a number she had never seen. The message was 4 words and a location. "Lobby. Holloway Building. Now. Grant." She stopped with her hand on the door. Read it twice. Looked at the time. 8:47. Grant's office building. The downtown tower that bore his name on the facade in 3-foot letters. The physical monument to everything he'd built. The address from which he had run a financial empire that was, she now understood, built on 2 foundations. One legitimate, one not, and which was about to be investigated by federal authorities in ways from which it would not recover. He was calling her to his ground, his territory, his name on the building, his people in the lobby, his attorney presumably already there with the emergency legal motion that would tie her evidence in procedural knots long enough for Teague's network to complete whatever they were planning. She should not go. Every rational calculation said she should not go. She should go to Hoboken, meet Celeste, hand the evidence to Miriam, and let the federal process do what it was designed to do. She stood at the hotel room door and thought about Nathan's voice on the phone. "They have me." The particular strain in it. The man who had made mistakes and might have been complicit in ways she still didn't fully understand, but who had also been there for 11 years and had handed her the envelope 8 weeks ago and had sat beside her on the stone bench in the garden in the October cold. She thought about Grant's voice in the study. She knows about Teague. We need to move up the timeline. She thought about 4 words spoken 14 years ago in a different lobby, a different tower, the day they'd met. "You're the smartest person in this room." Grant had said it, and she had laughed it off, and he had meant it as a compliment, and had spent 14 years being afraid of it and managing it and trying to reduce her to a size that wouldn't threaten him. She opened the door. She went to the elevator, down to the lobby, out into the Hoboken morning, moving toward the PATH station, because Grant wanted her at the Holloway building, and she was going to give him exactly that. But not the way he'd planned it, not with empty hands, not as the woman he'd walked away from in that foyer believing he'd already won. She was going to walk into that lobby with the memory card in her coat and Miriam's number on her phone and a federal contact whose reliability she hadn't fully verified, but whose investigation would proceed with or without her cooperation once the evidence declaration was filed, and she was going to stand in front of Grant Holloway in the lobby of the building that bore his name, and she was going to look him in the face, and he was going to see something there that he had calculated for and not found, not fear, not collapse, not the woman who absorbed his blows quietly and kept moving. The PATH train was crowded. She stood in the car and held the overhead bar with one hand and felt the movement of it under her feet, the particular rocking of underground transit, the dark rushing past the windows, the anonymous city moving around her with its perfect indifference. Her heart was still fast. She let it be fast. The body was allowed to know the stakes even when the mind needed to be still. The train surfaced into Manhattan light, and she watched the city come back through the windows, and she thought about one thing. Celeste Rowan, in a car somewhere on the way to Hoboken, with a single sheet of paper in her bag that could, in the right legal hands, cut through every procedural obstruction Grant's attorney could construct. One page, the survival clause. Grant's name beside a financial agreement that described, in the dry, unembellished language of corporate instruments, what should happen to significant sums of money if his wife died before him, signed 14 months before his wife had undergone a surgery that he had privately prepared to outlive her through. She had that. She had Celeste. She had the digital copies. And she was walking into the Holloway building lobby, which meant Grant was about to discover that the woman he had summoned was not the woman he thought he was summoning, and that the ground he believed he controlled had already, in the 18 hours since he'd spoken to Harlan Teague, shifted beneath him in ways he had not yet fully measured. She came up from the station into downtown morning light. The Holloway building was 2 blocks north. She could see it from here, the glass and steel of it, 44 floors of Grant self-construction rising into a sky that was beginning, at its edges, to break towards something clearer than the morning had promised. She walked toward it, her feet in hotel slippers on a Manhattan sidewalk, her coat with its hidden pocket, 3 years of her life compressed into a card against her ribs. And somewhere above her, Grant Holloway was waiting with his attorney and his emergency motions and everything he thought he knew about how this was going to end. She pushed through the revolving door. The lobby was marble and steel and soaring in the way of buildings whose owners needed the scale to feel real. She crossed it without slowing, and then she stopped. Because Grant was not upstairs. Grant was here, standing in the center of his own lobby in the gray suit he'd worn to Geneva, with his attorney beside him, a tall man with a briefcase and the expression of someone who was being paid very well to be here very early, and 2 other men she didn't recognize standing at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate. And on the far side of the lobby, near the security desk, standing with the contained alertness of someone who had also just arrived and was also doing rapid recalculation, Daniel Mercer, in the same dark suit, with 2 people beside him who were wearing the particular shoes of federal agents in the field. All of them, here, at Var once. Grant saw her at the same moment she saw him, and she watched the recalculation cross his face. She was here, she had come, and she had come without the collapse he'd expected, and in the half-second before his attorney put a hand on his arm, she saw him understand that something had gone wrong with the version of this morning he'd been planning. She walked toward the center of the lobby. Mercer moved at the same moment from the opposite side. Grant's attorney opened his briefcase, and the lobby of the Holloway building held its breath. 44 floors of glass and steel above them, the city moving outside the revolving doors, every piece of every plan laid by every person in this room arriving simultaneously at the same point in space and time. And Evelyn Ashcroft stopped walking exactly 3 feet from her husband and looked at him with eyes that had spent 14 years learning his face and now, this morning, were finished with what they found there. And she reached into her coat and removed the memory card and held it between 2 fingers where everyone in the lobby could see it. And the silence broke open like something that had been building pressure for a very long time. "Grant," she said. Her voice was even, clear. The voice of a woman who had made her last accommodation sometime in the previous 18 hours and had nothing left to perform. "It's over." His jaw was tight. His eyes moved from her face to the memory card to Mercer and back to her face, and she watched him make the calculation he had always made. The rapid assessment, the repositioning, the identification of the available moves, and she watched him arrive at the answer she had been waiting 14 years to give him. There were no moves left. His attorney stepped forward with a document and said something in a clipped, professional voice about emergency injunctive relief, and Evelyn did not look at the attorney and did not look at the document because at that precise moment, Daniel Mercer covered the remaining distance across the lobby floor with his colleagues and said 3 words to Grant Holloway's attorney that turned the man's face the particular color of someone realizing the instrument they are holding no longer functions. "Federal filing," Mercer said. "This morning. Your firm is named." The attorney's hand with the document dropped to his side. Grant looked at Evelyn. Just looked at her. Without the recalculation now, without the assessment or the repositioning, just the face of a man standing in the wreckage of something he had believed was impenetrable, looking at the person who had, with patience and precision and the 3 years he had given her by underestimating her, dismantled it from the inside. She held his gaze. And then her phone rang, Miriam's number, and she answered it without breaking eye contact with Grant, and Miriam said 4 words that completed everything. "Celeste is here. She's got it." The lobby of the Holloway building held 44 floors of silence above them, and outside the revolving doors the city moved in its ordinary magnificent indifference, and Evelyn Ashcroft stood in the center of it all with a phone at her ear and a memory card in her hand, and the full weight of 3 years of preparation arriving, finally, at the moment it was built for. The lobby did not erupt the way lobbies erupted in movies. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse, no moment of cinematic catharsis in which justice descended from some great height and landed with a sound everyone could hear. What happened was quieter, and in many ways more devastating for its quietness. Grant's attorney, the tall man with the briefcase, whose name Evelyn would later learn was Preston Lyle, 40 years in corporate law, 3 disciplinary reviews, 0 prior federal entanglements, opened the document he had been preparing to serve, and read the first paragraph of Mercer's federal filing that Mercer had placed in his hand and went very still. He read it a second time. Then he closed the document, picked up his briefcase, and said to Grant in a voice stripped of all its earlier professional authority, "I need to speak with my own counsel before we go any further." He walked to the far end of the lobby and made a phone call with his back turned, and that was the last time Preston Lyle ever acted in Grant Holloway's interest. Grant watched him go. He stood in the center of his own lobby in his Geneva suit, and he watched his attorney walk away, and he did not say anything for a long moment. The 2 men who had been standing at a discreet distance, Evelyn cataloged them now as private security, not Teague's people, not federal, just expensive men paid to make Grant feel contained, had moved back further, sensing with the animal accuracy of people in that profession that the situation had shifted beyond their job description. Mercer stood to Evelyn's left, close enough that his presence was a statement without being intrusive. The 2 agents with him had positioned themselves near the building's rear exit and the elevator bank with a casualness that was entirely professional and entirely deliberate. Grant looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. "The building," he said finally. His voice was low. Not the flat, controlled voice of a man executing a plan. Just a voice. "I built this building 12 years ago. There was nothing on this block but a parking structure and a dry cleaning business that had been closed for 2 years. He wasn't making an argument. He was saying something that needed to be said. The way a man says something when he understands it is among the last things he will say in a particular context. "I built this from nothing." "You built it with other people's money," she said. "Some of them didn't know they were involved." His jaw tightened. "That's not Grant." She kept her voice even. "Don't." He closed his mouth. He looked at the lobby around him. The marble, the steel, the soaring atrium, his name in 3-foot letters above the revolving doors. And she watched him look at it the way you looked at something when you were trying to memorize it. The expression of a man saying goodbye to the version of himself that had lived inside this building. Mercer stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, I'd like you to come with us voluntarily. We can do this here or we can do it at the office. Your choice. But we're doing it this morning. Grant looked at Mercer. Then he looked at Evelyn one more time. And in that look she found, beneath everything, the betrayal and the calculation and the 4-year plan to wind down their marriage that had been running in parallel with the life she thought they were living. Something she had not expected to find and did not know what to do with. Something that looked, stripped of all its architecture, like a man who had made a series of decisions that had seemed manageable at each individual turning point and had arrived, through that sequence of seemingly manageable decisions, at a morning he had never intended to be standing inside. She did not feel sorry for him. She was clear about that. But she registered the human fact of him, the actual person underneath the construction, and she held it without sentimentality and without dismissal, because she had spent 14 years being erased by this man, and she was not going to erase him back. She was going to be more careful than that. Go with them, she said quietly. Don't make it worse. He held her eyes for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Mercer and said, I'll need to make one call. You'll make it from our office, Mercer said, and Grant Holloway nodded once and walked toward the exit between the 2 federal agents with the particular straight-backed dignity of a man who had decided that this, at least, this final walk across his own lobby, he would do without falling apart. Evelyn watched him go until the revolving doors closed behind him. Then she exhaled. Long and slow, through her nose, the breath she'd been managing for the last 40 minutes finally released. Her legs were not shaking. She was distantly surprised by this. Her legs had every right to be shaking. Mercer came to stand beside her. The Hoboken filing, your attorney, is handling it now, she said. Celeste Rowan has a document referencing the survival clause, original copy in her possession since 14 months ago. It establishes the financial motive directly. Mercer was quiet for a moment. That's clean evidence, Mrs. Ashcroft. That's very useful to us. I know. She looked at the revolving doors. Nathan Cole, the estate cottage. Someone needs to... Already sent a car, he said. 20 minutes ago, when you came through those doors. We've had eyes on the property since 4 a.m. A pause. Cole is fine. The man at the cottage was one of Teague's low-level operational. He's in custody. She turned to look at Mercer directly, examined him the way she'd been unable to examine him across a hotel bar table, in full morning light, without the performance of a first meeting. He held her gaze steadily, with nothing evasive in it. The night of the hotel bar, she said, I thought about whether you were what you said you were, whether the timing of your call and the timing of the man in my kitchen was a coincidence or a connection. He nodded slowly. That was the right thing to think. And the man in your kitchen knew you'd be meeting with a federal contact that evening because Nathan Cole told him you'd received a call from an unknown federal number and were likely cooperating. Nathan didn't intend it as useful information to them. He made a comment to someone he believed was a household contractor. The contractor reported it. He paused. We weren't the source of the leak. Nathan was, unintentionally. She looked at the middle distance for a moment. The document in the desk, the one that listed NC as asset. We found it too, in the same search. We believe Grant put it there after your confrontation in the sitting room. It was placed to create doubt in you about Nathan, to isolate you. He said it plainly, without softening. It worked, for a period. She absorbed this. The document had been placed. Grant had known she would find the study with the lamp on, and the paper spread, had arranged for her to find exactly what would most efficiently destroy her trust in her only remaining ally. Had calculated her, correctly, down to the specific fear that would send her into a hotel corridor with bare feet and a memory card and no one to call. He knew me very well, she said. It wasn't a compliment. He did, Mercer agreed. You knew him better. She picked up her phone, called Miriam. It's done, she said when Miriam answered. He's with federal agents. Lyle withdrew. Where's Celeste? Sitting across from me, Miriam said, drinking tea and looking like she hasn't slept in a week, which, I assume, is accurate. The document is extraordinary, Evelyn. Original signature, 2 witnesses. The survival clause is explicit. Combined with the wire transfer records from the digital copies, we have a financial motive timeline that runs 4 years. No defense attorney alive is going to argue this into a corner. File the evidence declaration. Filing it as we speak. A pause. Evelyn, come to Hoboken. I think you and Celeste should be in the same room. She stood in the lobby of the Holloway building a moment longer. She looked at the atrium, the steel beams, the marble floor, the enormous fact of a thing built to last that was going to be dismantled. Then she turned and walked toward the revolving doors. The Hoboken office was small and warm in the way that small offices were warm. Inadequate heat supplemented by too many people and too much paper, and the particular lived-in quality of a place where work actually happened rather than being performed. Miriam's sister was a compact woman in her late 50s named Rosa, who looked at Evelyn when she walked in with the direct, unjudging assessment of someone who had spent her career dealing with people arriving in crisis, and then handed her a cup of coffee and pointed her toward a chair. Celeste was at the conference table. She looked up when Evelyn entered, and the look that passed between them was not warm exactly, and it was not the look of two women with any ordinary reason to be in the same room, but it was honest. The look of two people who had survived the same storm from different positions inside it, and were now, in the aftermath, determining what they were to each other. "Thank you for coming," Evelyn said. She sat down across from her. "You said my son would be protected," Celeste said. Not accusatory, just the most important thing, stated directly, the way young mothers stated the most important things. "I meant it." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Whatever happens with the legal proceedings, whatever is recovered from Grant's assets, whatever structure emerges, I will personally ensure there is a protected financial arrangement for your son, not through Grant's estate, through mine." She paused. "He didn't choose any of this. He deserves better than to start life as a footnote in a federal indictment." Celeste looked at the table for a moment, then back up. "Why?" "Because the alternative is punishing a child for his father's choices," Evelyn said. "And I have better things to do with whatever I have left than that." Celeste was quiet. Her hand rested on the table near her coffee cup, and she was looking at Evelyn with an expression that was working through several things simultaneously. Gratitude, guilt, the complex residue of having been used by a man she'd believed loved her, and the stranger and more disorienting experience of being offered something genuine by the woman she had most reason to expect cruelty from. "He told me you were cold," Celeste said finally. "Grant, when he talked about you early on, he said you were brilliant but cold, that you cared more about strategy than about people." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "He needed me to be that," she said. "It made everything simpler for him." The document Celeste had kept, the single page, the survival clause, was in Miriam's hands now, enclosed in a clear evidence sleeve, already photographed and recorded and folded into the federal evidence declaration that was at this moment moving through the appropriate channels, with the appropriate documentation, and would arrive before end of business in the hands of prosecutors who had been waiting 26 months for exactly this quality of material. Miriam went through the remaining legal structure with Evelyn over the next 2 hours. The separation filing was already in motion. The Ashcroft Family Preservation Trust held the estate cleanly and without viable challenge, given the timeline of its creation predating any separation action. The household accounts were fully restructured. The Connecticut property was uncontested. The digital evidence, properly documented and transferred through Mercer's office with Miriam present, had established a chain of custody that would survive federal scrutiny. What remained was the slower, uglier machinery of consequence, the months of legal proceedings, the federal investigation's expansion into Teague's network, the dismantling of financial structures that had been built across 7 states in 4 years and would take considerably longer to fully unwind than they had taken to construct. None of this would be clean. None of it would be fast. And some of it, Miriam told her plainly, would be genuinely painful in ways that had nothing to do with legal strategy. The public dimension of a federal case involving a named Manhattan financier, the exposure, the documented timeline of a marriage that had been, from one party's perspective, already over before either of them had admitted it. "You'll be in the coverage," Miriam said. "There's no way around it." "I know. For a while it will be relentless." "Miriam," she looked at her attorney, I sat in a hospital bed for 3 days and my husband called his criminal lawyer from a burner phone. I think I can handle coverage. Miriam looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed. A short, genuine sound. The laugh of a woman who had spent 40 years in the law and still occasionally encountered something that surprised her. Fair enough, she said. Nathan came to the Hoboken office at noon. He came alone, in the car that Mercer's people had released him from after the cottage situation was resolved, and he walked in looking like a man who had spent a difficult night and most of a difficult morning accounting for the decisions that had produced that night. He was wearing the same clothes as the previous day. There were hollows under his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. He stood in the doorway of the conference room and looked at Evelyn with an expression that had the particular quality of a man who had decided to offer no defense and no appeal and simply stand in front of whatever came. She looked at him for a long time. "The meeting with Teague," she said. 14 months ago. Tell me the whole thing." He sat down. He told her. It took 20 minutes, and she did not interrupt. He had been approached, he said, by a former professional contact who told him Teague's network had identified Evelyn as a target. Specifically, that Grant had begun exploring whether Teague's connections could provide certain services that would accelerate the resolution of the marriage on terms favorable to Grant. Nathan had arranged the meeting himself, presenting himself as someone with access to Evelyn's situation who was interested in providing information. His intention, he said, had been to get inside the conversation far enough to understand the shape of the threat and then bring it to Evelyn. "But you didn't bring it to me," she said. "No." "Why?" He looked at his hands on the table. "Because when I got into the room with Teague, I understood that the situation was larger than I'd assumed, and I was afraid that if I told you, you'd move before you were fully prepared, and moving before you were prepared against that organization." He stopped. "I made a decision to keep the information until I had enough of it to make it actionable rather than just frightening. And I kept making that decision for 14 months. And every month, the information got more complete, and the right moment kept moving forward, and then Grant brought Celeste home and everything accelerated past any timeline I'd managed in my head." She looked at him. The morning light through the office window was flat and honest, the kind of light that didn't help anyone look better than they were. And in it, Nathan Cole looked exactly like what he was. A 61-year-old man who had carried something too heavy in the wrong direction for too long and was now sitting with the weight of it visible on his face. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes. 14 months ago, the week after the meeting, you should have sat down with me and told me." "Yes." He didn't qualify it, didn't build a structure around it, just yes. "The storage unit," she said. "The subcontractor." "Genuine mistake," he said. "I have reviewed it 100 times since it happened. The subcontractor had no connection to Teague that I can find. It was simply, I used a contact that ran through a property management company that Grant had also used, and someone at that company reported the unit's location upstream. Not intentionally malicious, just a connection I didn't map." He paused. "The mistake I made with the storage unit is the same mistake I made with Teague. I kept things separate that needed to be together and trusted my own map when I should have trusted yours." She sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "The previous employer, the financial compliance work. You're not going to tell me more than you've told me. There are things from that period of my life that, no, I'm not going to. Not because they're a threat to you, because they belong to that time and I've put that time somewhere specific and I intend to leave it there." He looked at her directly. "I understand if that's not acceptable." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The Ashcroft Leadership Foundation." He blinked. "Mrs. Ashcroft." "I've been thinking about it since before any of this started. The East Wing, the scope of it, housing and scholarships for women in law and business. I've had the structure designed for 2 years in my head." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to need someone to run it, day to day. Someone who knows the property, knows the legal architecture, knows how to keep things organized and clean and connected in ways that don't come apart under pressure." She paused. "Someone who makes mistakes sometimes because everyone makes mistakes, and who tells me about them immediately." Nathan was very still. "Are you offering me—" "I'm telling you what I need," she said, "and telling you that the job exists and that it's yours if you want it." with the understanding that the next time you attend a meeting I don't know about, you tell me before you leave the building." She held his eyes. "Are we clear?" He exhaled. Something in his face that had been held very tightly for a very long time released a fraction. Not all the way. Maybe not ever all the way. But enough. "Clear," he said. The federal case against Grant Holloway moved with the deliberate, grinding momentum of federal cases. Not fast, not dramatic in its day-to-day unfolding, but inexorable in the way that things were inexorable when the evidence was what the evidence was. Harlan Teague's network, once the financial documentation was in federal hands, took approximately 6 weeks to begin producing the structural collapses that investigators had been working toward for 26 months. Shell entities dissolved. Bank accounts were frozen across 3 states. 3 co-conspirators accepted plea agreements within the first month, and the information those agreements produced accelerated everything downstream. Grant was indicted on 11 federal counts: fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and 3 counts that related specifically to his participation in the network's financial architecture over 4 years. Preston Lyle, having withdrawn from representation, was himself named as a person of interest in connection with the legal instruments he'd processed through his firm on behalf of entities he claimed not to have known were connected to organized crime. The claim was, Miriam told Evelyn over coffee one morning in November, not going to survive scrutiny. Harlan Teague fought extradition from Chicago for 7 weeks before his own attorney advised him, apparently in terms he found persuasive, that continuing to fight was producing worse outcomes than cooperation. The network he'd spent 15 years building was, piece by piece, being mapped and photographed and testified about in federal proceedings, and there was nothing left for him to protect by fighting. Evelyn did not follow the proceedings closely. She followed them enough to know what she needed to know, and she relied on Miriam to tell her the parts that required her attention, and she trusted Miriam's judgment about which parts those were. What she spent her time on instead was the foundation. The East Wing renovation took 4 months. She supervised it personally, not the way she'd supervised it previously, deferring to contractors and accepting their timelines and their definitions of done. She was there every day, in work clothes, with a copy of the specifications and a willingness to have uncomfortable conversations about quality and timeline that she had, in a previous life, softened herself out of having. Nathan was there too, learning the systems, building the operational structure that would run the foundation once it was open. They worked side by side in a way that was not without its friction. There were days when the memory of what had been kept from her sat in the room between them with a weight that neither of them pretended wasn't there. But the friction was honest and the work was real, and by the time the East Wing was finished, she understood that what she and Nathan had was not the simple, uncomplicated trust of the previous 11 years. It was something harder and more specifically earned, which was in the end a better foundation for the things she intended to build. She went to see Grant once, in November, 6 weeks after the lobby, at the federal detention facility where he was being held pending trial. She was not required to go. Miriam advised against it. She went anyway because she had questions that the legal proceedings would not answer, and because she had decided that arriving at the end of a 14-year marriage without those answers was a form of incompleteness she was not willing to accept. He looked different in a facility jumpsuit in a visitation room, smaller somehow. Not physically, he was the same broad-shouldered, silver-haired man, but the physical space he occupied seemed less than it had been. She sat across from him at the visitation table and looked at his face, and he looked at hers, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "The survival clause," she said. "What were you planning?" He looked at the table, then back up. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing specific. The clause was Teague's structure. He had it in all his financial agreements with partners who had spouses. He called it standard risk management." He held her eyes. "I told myself it was just paperwork." "Did you believe that?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't think I did. I think I chose not to examine it too closely because examining it would have required me to be a different kind of person than I decided to be." He said this without the performance, without the flatness. Just plainly, in the voice she'd heard that night in the kitchen when he said she knows about Teague, the voice underneath all the other voices. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. No, she agreed. It isn't. Are you... He started, stopped. Is there anything I can... No, she said. Not unkindly, just finally. There isn't. She stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at him one last time, the actual man, the human fact of him, the complete and complicated and genuinely frightening person she had shared 14 years with, and she held that look long enough to be sure she had taken the full measure of it. Then she turned and walked out of the visitation room and through the facility exit and into the November air, and she stood on the sidewalk and breathed. She did not cry then either. She had cried once, 3 weeks earlier, alone in the north sitting room of the estate that was fully and uncontestedly hers, sitting in the chair by the window in the dark, the kind of crying that had nothing to do with grief for Grant and everything to do with grief for the version of herself that had spent 14 years in a house with a man who had been planning against her before she'd understood there was anything to plan against. She had cried for about 20 minutes, and then she had washed her face and gone to look at the renovation plans for the East Wing, and the crying had not recurred. She didn't think it would. She had given it the space it needed, and then she had moved on, which was the only thing she knew how to do with things that needed to be felt and then completed. The Ashcroft Leadership Foundation opened in March. It was a Tuesday, which Evelyn had chosen deliberately. She had no interest in making the opening a Friday night event, something social and celebratory, an occasion for photographs and speeches and champagne. She wanted it to open on a working day, because it was a working institution, and she wanted it to begin the way it intended to continue. 8 young women arrived on the first day. 4 scholarship residents, 3-day program participants, one who had simply seen the foundation's listing online and shown up without an appointment to ask if there was room. There was room. Evelyn had built in room because she had learned that people arrived when they were ready and not before, and that a structure built for a fixed number was a structure that would always fail someone standing at the door. Nathan was in his office by 7:30 that morning, which was not unusual. He had established a rhythm with the foundation's operations that was comprehensive in the way his rhythms always were. Thorough, anticipatory, organized in ways that would not come apart under pressure. He had also, in the 6 months since the lobby, told her 3 things she hadn't known. A brief professional detail from his previous employment that she had filed without interrogating further, the name of the property management contact whose contractor had accessed the storage unit, and the specific moment in the 14 months between his Teague meeting and Grant walking through the front door when he had decided to tell her everything and then not told her. He described that moment with the particular precision of a man who had replayed it many times. She listened. She did not tell him it was all right because it was not entirely all right, but she did tell him that people made decisions they later had to live inside of, and that what mattered more than the decision was what came after it, and that she believed she knew what came after it in his case. He had looked at her when she said this with the expression she'd come to know as his version of gratitude. Not effusive, not demonstrative, just a stilling of the face that meant something had landed. Celeste visited the foundation in April with her son. He was 6 weeks old and very small, and had, as far as Evelyn could tell, no opinion about anything except the positioning of his own hands, which he seemed to find endlessly interesting. Celeste looked tired in the way new mothers look tired, fundamentally, structurally, the weariness of someone doing the most demanding physical work of their life, but also, Evelyn thought, more present than she had seemed in the kitchen of the Holloway estate 7 months earlier, more inhabited by her own life. They sat in the East Wing common room, which had the high ceilings and large windows of the original architecture and the purposeful warmth of a space Evelyn had renovated with actual use in mind rather than the performance of elegance. Celeste held her son and drank the coffee Evelyn had brought from the kitchen and looked around the room at the young women passing through, talking, working, moving with the particular energy of people who were somewhere they had chosen to be. "This is good," Celeste said. Simply, without qualification. "It's a start," Evelyn said. "Are you..." Celeste looked at her. "Are you happy?" I know that's a strange question given everything. Evelyn considered it. She looked around the room, the young women, the morning light through the restored windows. Nathan's office door visible at the end of the corridor with its small, neat plaque. She thought about the word happy and what it meant after everything the word had been adjacent to, and she thought about the difference between happiness, which she had chased for 14 years in a marriage that had been unwinding from the inside, and something else, something that didn't have quite as simple a name, the satisfaction of a structure that was built correctly, the specific earned quality of a morning that belonged to her because she had fought for the ground it was standing on. "I'm something," she said. "I'll figure out the word for it." Celeste looked at her son. The baby had found his hands again and was examining them with his whole face, the profound, concentrated attention of someone encountering something remarkable. "He's going to want to know about his father someday," she said quietly. "I don't know what I'll tell him." "Tell him the truth," Evelyn said, "when he's old enough to hold it. The truth is what it is, and children are stronger than we think they are when we give them the actual thing instead of the version we constructed to protect ourselves." She paused. "That's what I would have wanted. If someone had told me, early enough, the actual truth about the man I was marrying." Celeste looked at her. "Would you have believed them?" Evelyn thought about this honestly, about the woman she had been at 28, meeting Grant Holloway in a lobby that would eventually bear his name, hearing him say, "You're the smartest person in this room," and feeling the particular complicated pleasure of being seen by someone who seemed worth being seen by. "Probably not," she said. "But I'd have had the information, and information changes things even when we can't act on it yet. It changes what we're able to see later." She looked at the baby. "Give him the information. Let him do what he can with it." The Grant proceedings wrapped in October of the following year with a plea agreement that Miriam called, with the careful understatement of an attorney who had learned not to celebrate before the gavel fell, as complete as these things get. 11 counts, a substantial period of federal custody, and the full cooperation with the Teague investigation that had been trading for a marginal reduction in sentencing terms. The Holloway building was acquired by a real estate holding company in a federal asset liquidation process and became, within 2 years, the headquarters of a financial technology firm that had no particular interest in whose name it had once displayed above its entrance. Harlan Teague was tried separately and convicted on 14 counts. The network he had built across 15 years in 7 states was, by the time the last trial concluded, documented in enough federal court filings to constitute a thorough and damning history of what could be constructed when money moved fast enough and people looked the other way long enough. Evelyn was not in the courtroom for either verdict. She was at the foundation. Both days she was at the foundation. There was an evening in November, more than a year after the marble foyer, after the wedding ring on the console table, after the bare feet on cold stone and the hotel slippers on a Manhattan sidewalk, when she walked through the East Wing after the last resident had gone to her room and the last light in the common area had been turned off. She walked slowly, which she didn't always do. She was usually a woman who moved with purpose, who had a destination and moved toward it. But this evening she walked slowly, and she looked at the room she had made from what had been her imprisonment, at the shelves of books and the tables where people worked, and the small photographs on the walls that residents had pinned there because it was their space and they were claiming it. She stopped in the middle of the corridor and stood still for a moment in the quiet. The building breathed around her with the sound of people sleeping, small sounds, the occasional settling of an old house, the particular inhabited silence of a place that was being used for what it was built for. She had been the smartest person in many rooms. Grant had said it first, and it had been true, and she had spent 14 years allowing that truth to be managed and contained and directed toward purposes that served him rather than her. The work of the last year, the legal dismantling, the foundation, the slow daily construction of something that would outlast all of it, had not been the work of the smartest person in the room. It had been the work of a woman who had gotten tired of being smart in service of someone else's architecture and had decided at 42, with a back that still ached from a surgery her husband had quietly prepared to outlive, to build something of her own. She walked to the end of the corridor and through the door that opened onto the small rear garden. Not the main garden, not the ornamental one she'd looked at from the kitchen window on the morning of the last ordinary day. This was the foundation's garden, smaller, planted with things that were meant to be used. Herbs, flowering plants that bloomed in sequence through the spring and summer. A stone bench against the far wall that she had insisted on in the renovation plans because she had known she would need somewhere to sit outside in the quiet. She sat on the bench. The November air was cold and clean. The city hummed beyond the garden wall in its constant, irreducible way, the sound of a million people doing the things people did in the ordinary hours, sleeping and worrying and loving and planning and making the decisions they would later have to live inside of. She sat with her hands on her knees and her back straight and her eyes open. She was not performing composure. There was no one to perform for. She was simply sitting in the cold garden of the things she had built from the materials of a life she had survived, and she was letting the quiet be what it was. The back ached, still. It would probably always ache. The physical therapist had said as much, in the careful language of medical professionals who were trained to give accurate information without unnecessarily distressing people. There may be some residual discomfort long term, and she had accepted this the way she had accepted most accurate information, factually, without the softening of pretending it was something other than what it was. She thought about the peonies Grant had sent to the hospital. She thought about the moment. It had lasted less than 3 seconds, when she had looked at those flowers and known that something was wrong without yet knowing what. The instinct that had arrived before the understanding, the way instinct always arrived before understanding in the people who had learned to trust it. She had trusted it, eventually. Not as early as she should have, but eventually. That was the thing about survival. It was never the clean story you told afterward. It was messier and slower and full of the moments where you hadn't moved when you should have moved, the decisions you'd made for the wrong reasons, the trust you'd extended past the point where trust was warranted, the 14 months you'd sat on information because the timing never felt exactly right. And then one day a man walked into your house with a pregnant woman and set something in motion that could not be stopped. And the plan you'd been building in the silence between all those imperfect decisions was the thing that was still standing when everything else came down. She had not come through this hole. She would not pretend she had. There were things from those 14 years that would not come back. The particular trust that came from never having needed to be this careful. The ease of a morning that belonged to itself rather than to a larger strategic picture. Small things, private things. Things that had no name in the legal proceedings, but that she felt sometimes in the quiet, the shape of what had been used up. She was not whole. She was something more specific than whole. She was intact. The center had held. The thing she was, underneath all the performances and the armor and the 14 years of careful management of her own intelligence in a household that required her to be smaller than she was. That thing had held, and she was sitting in the garden of the Ashcroft Leadership Foundation on a cold November evening, and she was breathing, and she was present, and she was, for the first time in longer than she could precisely measure, entirely herself. She sat there until the cold made her hands stiff. Then she stood, straightened her coat, and walked back inside. There was work in the morning. There was always work in the morning. She had made sure of it. She turned off the last light in the corridor and went upstairs, and the house settled into its inhabited quiet around her, and outside the garden wall the city kept its constant, irreducible sound, and Evelyn Ashcroft slept.